The massive clamshell cracked open with a sound like thunder, revealing something that made Samuel's weathered hands tremble violently. Inside lay a pearl, the size of a child's head, glowing with an otherworldly copper light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. After decades of loneliness and grief, the 72-year-old fisherman had discovered something worth more than gold, but he had no idea that this ancient treasure would soon turn his quiet coastal life into a nightmare of greed, betrayal, and danger. Welcome to a story that proves sometimes the greatest treasures become our heaviest burdens. I'm sharing this incredible tale from my studio here in America. But I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this fisherman's story has traveled across the world. The Atlantic wind howled through the cracked boards of Samuel Rowe's weathered shack, carrying with it the salt and sorrow that had defined his life for the past 23 years. Each morning, the 72-year-old fisherman rose before dawn, his joints protesting with the familiar ache of age and hard labor, his calloused hands reaching automatically for the photograph on his nightstand, a faded image of a woman with laughing eyes and a small boy with gap-toothed grin, both claimed by the sea during a storm that still haunted his dreams. "Morning, Ruth. Morning, Charlie," he whispered to the photograph, his voice rough from disuse. Living alone did that to a man, made his voice foreign even to himself, when he finally had reason to use it. Samuel shuffled to his small kitchen, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight, each sound echoing in the emptiness that had become his constant companion. The coffee pot, dented and blackened from decades of use, sat waiting on the stove. He filled it with water from the tap that always ran slightly brown, no matter how many times he'd tried to fix the pipes. Some things he'd learned were beyond fixing. Outside, the Maine coast stretched gray and forbidding in the pre-dawn darkness. His shack sat perched on a rocky outcrop battered by storms and time, its paint long since surrendered to the elements. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down the winding coastal road, and Samuel preferred it that way. Grief, he'd discovered, was best nursed in solitude. As the coffee percolated, filling the small space with its bitter aroma, Samuel stood at his window and watched the sea. It moved like a living thing, breathing in and out with the tide, sometimes gentle as a mother's touch, sometimes violent as a drunkard's rage. It was both his livelihood and his tormentor, the source of his meager income and the thief of everything he'd ever loved. "You hungry old beast," he muttered to the waves. "What you planning today? Another empty net? Another broken trap?" The sea, as always, kept its secrets. Samuel poured his coffee into a chipped mug that read, "World's Best Grandpa," a Father's Day gift from Charlie given just 2 weeks before the storm. He'd never had the chance to become a grandfather. Charlie had been 8 years old, all knobby knees and endless questions when the sea claimed him. Ruth had been trying to save their son when she was pulled under too. Samuel had been in town buying supplies, helpless and unaware, as his entire world drowned 5 miles away. He pushed the memories down, swallowing them with the scalding coffee. Memory was a luxury he couldn't afford before a day's work. His boat, the Ruth Marie, waited at the small private dock he'd built with his own hands back when he still had reasons to plan for the future. She was a modest vessel, 32 feet of weathered fiberglass and stubborn reliability. Like Samuel himself, she'd seen better days but kept going through sheer habit and necessity. "Morning, girl," Samuel said as he climbed aboard, his breath misting in the cold morning air. "Ready for another dance?" The engine coughed to life on the third try, sputtering black smoke before settling into its familiar rumble. Samuel cast off the lines with practiced efficiency, his movements automatic after 5 decades of the same routine. The boat nosed out into the choppy waters, heading toward his usual fishing grounds 5 miles offshore. But this morning felt different somehow. There was a charge in the air, an electric quality to the dawn that made the hair on Samuel's arms stand on end beneath his thick wool sweater. The sky blazed with unusual colors, not just the typical pink and gold of sunrise, but deep purples and strange greens that reminded him of something his grandfather had once told him years ago when Samuel was just a boy himself. "Once in a lifetime, Sam," his grandfather had said, his eyes gleaming with the light of old stories, "the sea gives up its greatest treasure. The dawn pearl, they call it. Hidden in a giant clam that only surfaces when the conditions are exactly right. My own grandfather claimed he saw one once glowing like captured sunlight beneath the waves. But greed got the better of the men who found it, and they say the sea took them all back one by one until the pearl was lost again. Samuel shook his head, dismissing the memory. Fairy tales and fishermen's yarns. His grandfather had been full of such stories, each one more fantastic than the last. Still, as he guided the Ruth Marie through the dawn-painted waters, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this particular morning. The fog rolled in as he reached his usual spot, thick and impenetrable as cotton batting. Samuel cut the engine, letting the boat drift while he prepared his lines. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle lap of waves against the hull and his own breathing. Even the gulls, usually raucous in their morning feeding, were quiet. That's when he saw it, a faint glow beneath the surface, perhaps 20 yards from his boat. At first, Samuel thought it was phosphorescence, the natural glow of disturbed plankton that sometimes lit up the water at night. But this was different. The light was steady, concentrated, and seemed to pulse with a rhythm all its own. "What in the hell?" Samuel muttered, leaning over the rail for a better look. The fog began to lift, revealing the source of the light. There, wedged between two barnacle-covered rocks in the shallow water near the coastline's edge, was the largest clam Samuel had ever seen. It had to be 4 feet across its shell, thick and ancient-looking, covered in seaweed and smaller mollusks that had made their home on its surface. And from between the slightly parted shells came that strange copper-colored light. Samuel's heart began to pound. He'd been fishing these waters for 50 years, knew every rock, every current, every hidden reef. This clam hadn't been here yesterday. Hell, it hadn't been here last week. Which meant it had either moved here on its own, unlikely given its massive size, or it had been uncovered by the recent storms that had battered the coast. He started the engine, maneuvering the Ruth Marie as close to the rocks as he dared. The water here was treacherous, full of hidden dangers that could tear the bottom out of a boat in seconds. But Samuel knew these waters like the lines on his own palms. He dropped anchor 15 feet from the clam and stood there staring at it, his mind racing. If he tried to retrieve it alone, he'd likely fail. The thing had to weigh several hundred pounds at least. He'd need help equipment, maybe even a winch. But if he left to get help, someone else might spot it. Fishermen were early risers, and this spot wasn't exactly secret. Tommy Garrett often fished these waters, and the man had eyes like a hawk and a greedy streak a mile wide. "Damn it all," Samuel muttered, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. He thought of Leonard Pike, his only real friend left in the world. Leonard was 75, older than Samuel, and twice as stubborn, but he was trustworthy. They'd known each other since they were boys, had worked the boats together, as young men had stood as best man at each other's weddings. Leonard had been there the day they pulled Ruth and Charlie from the water, had held Samuel back when he tried to dive in after them, even though it was already too late. Samuel pulled out his cell phone, a concession to modernity he'd resisted until last year, and dialed Leonard's number. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Sam Christ, what time is it?" "Leo, I need you to come out here. Bring your winch and some strong rope." "What's wrong?" "You stuck on something." Samuel hesitated. Even over the phone, even to his oldest friend, the words seemed too fantastic to speak aloud. "I found something, Leo. Something big. Can't explain over the phone, but I need your help and I need your silence." There was a pause on the other end. Then Leonard said, "Give me your coordinates. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Samuel gave him the location and ended the call. He sat down on the deck, his eyes never leaving the glowing clam. The light seemed to pulse stronger now, as if responding to his attention. Or maybe that was just his imagination overheated by possibility and the memory of his grandfather's stories. While he waited, Samuel's mind wandered to what the pearl might mean. Money, certainly. Enough to fix up the shack, maybe even move somewhere warm. Enough to stop waking up at 4 a.m. to chase fish that seemed fewer and farther between each passing year. Enough to visit Ruth and Charlie's graves with flowers every day, instead of just on Sundays when he could afford them. But there was something else, something harder to define. For 23 years, Samuel had lived in a kind of purgatory, going through the motions of life, without really living. He ate because his body required food. He slept because exhaustion demanded it. He fished because it was all he knew how to do. But he hadn't felt truly alive since that terrible day when the sheriff's car pulled up to his shack, and he'd known even before the man spoke that his world had ended. Maybe this pearl, if that's what it really was, represented something more than money. Maybe it was a sign that his suffering hadn't been for nothing, that there was still some purpose to his continued existence beyond mere survival. Leonard's boat appeared through the morning mist right on schedule. His old trawler, the Persistent Dream, chugging along with its characteristic wheeze. Leonard himself stood at the wheel, his weathered face set in a scowl of concentration. Despite his age, he was still a bear of a man, 6'2", with shoulders that had once been legendary in the local arm wrestling circuit. "This better be good, Sam," Leonard called out as he drew alongside the Ruth Marie. "I left a warm bed and a hot breakfast for this." "Look over there," Samuel said, pointing toward the rocks. Leonard followed his finger and his eyes widened when he saw the massive clam and its pulsing light. He let out a low whistle. "Holy Mother of God! Is that what I think it is? If you're thinking it's the biggest damn clam either of us has ever seen, then yes. That light, I know." Leonard was quiet for a moment, then said, "You remember your grandfather's story about the dawn pearl?" "Been trying not to think about it." "Sam, if that's really... if there's actually a pearl in there the size of what the stories claim..." "We'll be rich," Samuel finished, "or cursed, depending on which version of the story you believe." Leonard snorted. "I'll take my chances with a curse if it means I can finally pay off my mortgage and buy Helen that trip to Paris she's been dreaming about for 40 years. They worked together with the efficiency of men who'd spent their lives on the water. Leonard maneuvered his larger boat closer to the rocks, while Samuel attached the winch cable to the strongest points on the clam's shell, diving into the frigid water 3 times to secure the bonds properly. His body protested he wasn't a young man anymore, and the Atlantic in early spring was cold enough to steal your breath and make your heart stutter. "You all right, Sam?" Leonard called out when Samuel surfaced for the 3rd time, gasping. "Fine," Samuel managed through chattering teeth. "Just give me a minute." He hauled himself back onto the Ruth Marie, his clothes streaming water, his hands numb and clumsy. But the cables were secure. Leonard started the winch, and slowly, incrementally, the massive clam began to move. It took them 2 hours to get it onto the Persistent Dream's deck. 2 hours of careful maneuvering, of almost losing it twice, when the cables slipped of Samuel's heart, hammering so hard he thought it might give out entirely. But finally the clam lay before them, even more impressive in full daylight. "Jesus Christ," Leonard breathed. "Look at the size of it." The shell was beautiful in its ancient ugliness, encrusted with barnacles and seaweed, scarred by who knew how many years beneath the ocean. But that light still pulsed from within, visible even in the morning sun, and both men stood transfixed by it. "We should open it here," Leonard said. "Make sure there's actually something inside before we go any further." Samuel shook his head. "Too exposed. Anyone could come by. We take it to my place, open it there." "Your shack's 3 miles from the water. How are we going to get it there?" "Your truck. We'll use the winch to load it." Leonard looked skeptical but didn't argue. They covered the clam with a tarp, though the edges of light still leaked out around the edges, and headed back to the small harbor where Leonard kept his truck. Loading the clam was another challenge, drawing curious looks from the few early morning fishermen preparing their boats. Samuel tried to act casual, but his hands shook as he guided the winch cable, and he could feel eyes on them, calculating and curious. "What you boys got there?" Tommy Garrett called out from his boat, his voice carrying across the water. "Old engine block," Leonard lied smoothly. "Been underwater so long it's covered in growth. Sam's going to use it for a mooring." Tommy didn't look convinced, but he didn't push it. Still, Samuel saw him watching as they drove away, and he didn't like the look in the man's eyes. The drive to Samuel's shack felt like the longest 3 miles of his life. Every bump in the road made him wince, afraid the clam would shift and fall, or worse, that it would open and reveal its treasure to anyone who happened to be passing by. But they made it without incident, backing the truck up to Samuel's workshop, a shed attached to the main shack where he repaired nets and maintained his fishing gear. It took both of them and every ounce of strength they possessed to get the clam inside and onto the reinforced workbench. By the time they finished, both men were gasping, sweat streaming down their faces despite the cool morning air. "We're too old for this shit," Leonard panted, leaning against the wall. "Speak for yourself," Samuel replied, though his own chest was heaving. "You got your tools." Leonard nodded and retrieved a crowbar and hammer from his truck. They positioned themselves on opposite sides of the clam, and Samuel felt a moment of almost superstitious dread. What if there was nothing inside? What if it was just a giant clam with some kind of phosphorescent algae making it glow? What if his grandfather's story was just that? A story on three, Leonard said, wedging his crowbar into the seam between the shells. 1, 2. They pried together, and for a moment nothing happened. The clam held tight, as if reluctant to give up its secret. Then with a sound like breaking stone, the shell cracked open. The light that flooded the workshop was like nothing Samuel had ever seen. It was warm and cool at the same time, copper and gold and silver all at once. And there, nestled in the meat of the clam, like the world's most impossible egg, was a pearl the size of a football. Both men fell silent, staring at the treasure before them. The pearl's surface was perfect, without blemish or flaw, and it seemed to glow from within with its own source of light. Samuel reached out slowly, his hand trembling, and touched it. It was warm, almost alive feeling, and for a moment he could have sworn he felt a pulse like a heartbeat. "My God," Leonard whispered. "It's real. It's actually real." Samuel couldn't speak. He stood there, his hand on the pearl, and felt 23 years of grief and loneliness crack inside him like ice breaking up in spring. Tears ran down his weathered cheeks, and he didn't even try to stop them. "Sam," Leonard's voice was concerned. "You okay?" Samuel started, then stopped. How could he explain what he was feeling? That for the first time since Ruth and Charlie died, he felt like the universe had given him something instead of taking it away. That this pearl, this impossible treasure, felt like a message from the sea itself, an apology perhaps, or a chance at redemption. "We need to be smart about this," Leonard said, ever practical. "Something like this, it's trying to attract attention, the wrong kind of attention." Samuel nodded, wiping his eyes. "We tell no one. Not until we figure out what to do with it." "Agreed. But, Sam, we can't keep this secret forever. Something this valuable. There are laws, procedures. We might need to report it to the state, maybe even the feds." "I know. Just give me some time. I need to think." Leonard clapped him on the shoulder. "Take all the time you need, but be careful. Tommy Garrett saw us with something, and that man's got a nose for opportunity and fewer scruples than a politician." After Leonard left, Samuel sat alone in his workshop, staring at the pearl. The light it cast made everything look different. The tools on his walls, the nets hanging from the ceiling, even his own hands. It was like seeing the world through new eyes, or perhaps very old ones' eyes that remembered when magic was still possible. He thought about Ruth, how she would have laughed at the absurdity of it all. A pearl the size of a football, Sam. Really, what's next? Mermaids. He could hear her voice so clearly, it made his chest ache. And Charlie would have been beside himself with excitement. He would have wanted to know everything, how pearls formed, how big the clam was, whether there were more of them out there. Charlie had been the curious one, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how the world worked. "I found it, buddy," Samuel whispered to the empty workshop. "The treasure Grandpa used to talk about. You would have loved this." The pearl pulsed gently, its light warming the cold space, and for a moment Samuel felt less alone than he had in years. But Leonard had been right to worry. By that evening, Samuel noticed things that made him uneasy. A truck driving slowly past his shack, then returning an hour later. Footprints in the mud near his workshop that weren't his or Leonard's. And when he went to the small grocery store in town for supplies, people looked at him differently. Speculative, calculating looks that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Martha Henderson, who ran the store, tried to make casual conversation as she rang up his items. "Heard you and Leonard were out early this morning. Good catch." "Nothing special," Samuel replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Tommy Garrett says you pulled something big out of the water, something covered in growth." "Old engine block. Going to use it for a mooring." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly. She'd known Samuel for 30 years, knew he already had plenty of moorings. But she didn't push it. Still, as he left the store, he heard her on the phone, her voice low and urgent. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He moved the pearl from the workshop to his bedroom, wrapping it in an old quilt Ruth had made during the first year of their marriage. The light still leaked through, casting strange shadows on the walls, making the familiar space feel foreign and enchanted. He dozed fitfully, dreaming of Ruth and Charlie, of his grandfather, and stories of cursed treasure. In his dreams, the pearl spoke to him in a voice like the sea itself, telling him secrets he couldn't quite remember when he woke. At 3 in the morning, he heard something outside. Footsteps careful and deliberate circling his shack. Samuel grabbed the shotgun he kept by his bed, loaded with rock salt, enough to discourage but not kill. He crept to the window and peered out. 3 figures moved in the darkness, trying doors and windows. One of them was Tommy Garrett. Samuel recognized his distinctive limp from a fishing accident years ago. The other 2 were strangers, younger men with hard faces and careful movements. Samuel's heart raced. If they broke in, if they found the pearl, he thought about calling the police, but what would he say? And how would he explain the pearl? No, he needed to handle this himself. He made noise deliberately, pumping the shotgun loudly enough for them to hear. The figures froze, then quickly retreated into the darkness. Samuel heard a vehicle start up down the road and drive away. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Samuel made a decision. The pearl was too dangerous to keep too powerful a lure for the greedy and desperate. His grandfather's story had been right about that much. The dawn pearl brought trouble to those who tried to possess it. But he couldn't just give it up either. This pearl had awakened something in him, had made him feel alive again for the first time in over 2 decades. There had to be a way to preserve it, to share it without letting it destroy him or anyone else. He called Leonard as soon as it was a reasonable hour. "We need to move it," he said without preamble. "Tonight, Tommy Garrett and some friends were sniffing around last night." "Shit, I was afraid of that. Where do we take it?" Samuel had been thinking about this all morning. The museum in Portland, the Maritime Museum, they'll know what to do with it, how to preserve it properly, and they'll make sure it's protected. Leonard was quiet for a moment. "You sure about this, Sam? This could be your ticket to a better life. You could sell it, make enough money to never worry again. And spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, fighting off people who think they deserve a piece of it." "No, Leo, this pearl, it's bigger than money. It needs to be somewhere people can see it, wonder at it. Ruth would have wanted that, Charlie too." "All right, I'll bring my truck around at sunset. We'll load it up and drive to Portland tonight." The day passed with agonizing slowness. Samuel tried to go about his normal routine, but his mind kept returning to the pearl hidden in his bedroom. Twice more vehicles drove slowly past his shack, and he saw people on the distant rocks with binoculars watching his property. As the sun began to set, Leonard arrived with his truck. They worked quickly, wrapping the pearl in multiple layers of blankets and tarp to hide its light. But just as they were loading it into the truck bed, Tommy Garrett's pickup pulled into Samuel's driveway, followed by 2 other vehicles. 6 men got out, including Tommy and the 2. Samuel had seen the night before. They spread out, blocking any escape route. "Evening, Sam," Tommy said, his voice friendly but his eyes hard. "Leonard, heard you boys found something interesting yesterday." "Don't know what you're talking about," Samuel replied, his hand moving to the shotgun he'd placed in the truck cab. "Come now, no need for that. We're all friends here, just curious about what you're loading up in such a hurry. Must be something pretty valuable to need all that wrapping." "It's none of your concern, Tommy." Tommy's friendly facade dropped. "See, that's where you're wrong. You pulled something from waters we all fish. Whatever it is belongs to all of us. Share and share alike, isn't that the fisherman's way?" "The fisherman's way is to mind your own business and respect another man's catch," Leonard said, stepping forward. Despite his age, he still cut an imposing figure. One of the younger men pulled out a knife, the blade catching the last rays of sunlight. "Maybe we should just take a look ourselves." The situation was escalating quickly. Samuel's mind raced, looking for a way out that didn't end in violence. Then he heard something that made his heart sink, sirens in the distance getting closer. "Someone called the cops," one of the men said nervously. Tommy's eyes narrowed. "You boys trying to pull something?" "We didn't call anyone," Samuel said truthfully, though he suspected Martha Henderson might have, or perhaps one of his other neighbors who'd noticed the unusual activity. The sirens grew louder. The younger men started backing toward their vehicles, but Tommy stood his ground. "This isn't over, Sam. Whatever you found, we'll find out about it. And when we do, you'll wish you'd been more neighborly." The police car pulled into the driveway just as Tommy's group was leaving. Sheriff Daniel Morrison, a man Samuel had known since he was a boy, got out and surveyed the scene. "Everything all right here, Sam?" "Fine, Dan. Just some uninvited visitors." The sheriff looked at the wrapped bundle in the truck, then back at Samuel. "There's been a lot of talk in town today. Something about you and Leonard finding something valuable. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Samuel met his eyes steadily. "Just cleaning out some old equipment, taking it to Portland to sell for scrap." The sheriff clearly didn't believe him, but he didn't push it. "Well, you be careful on the roads. Lots of desperate people out there these days. Might be safer to make a trip like that during daylight hours." After the sheriff left, Samuel and Leonard sat in the truck cab, both breathing heavily from the tension. "That was close," Leonard said. "Too close. We need to go now before Tommy comes back with more people." They drove through the gathering darkness, taking back roads to avoid any potential ambush. The pearl in the truck bed seemed to pulse with its own light visible even through all the wrapping like a heartbeat of pure luminescence. Samuel thought about his life, about the choices that had brought him to this moment. He'd been a fisherman all his life like his father and grandfather before him. He'd married his high school sweetheart, had a son, built a life that, while simple, had been complete. Then the sea had taken it all away, leaving him hollow, going through the motions of living without really being alive. Now this pearl had changed everything. Not because of its value, though he understood it must be worth a fortune, but because of what it represented. It was proof that miracles still existed, that the universe could still surprise him after all these years of numbness and routine. "You know," Leonard said, breaking the silence, "Helen thinks I'm crazy, but I swear that pearl, it's like it's alive somehow, like it knows things." I know what you mean," Samuel admitted. "When I touch it, I don't know how to describe it, like I'm connected to something bigger, older, like the sea is trying to tell me something." They reached Portland just after midnight. The Maritime Museum was closed, of course, but Samuel had called ahead to the emergency number, explaining he had a significant discovery that needed immediate attention. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the museum's chief curator, met them at the employee entrance, her eyes skeptical behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Rowe, I hope you understand that we get calls about significant discoveries quite frequently. Most turn out to be interesting, but hardly." She stopped mid-sentence as Samuel pulled back the wrapping, revealing the pearl. The copper light flooded the loading dock, making Dr. Martinez's face go slack with shock. She approached slowly, as if in a dream, her hands reaching out, but not quite touching the pearl's surface. This can't be. Do you have any idea what you've found?" "My grandfather called it the dawn pearl," Samuel said quietly. Dr. Martinez's eyes widened even further. "The dawn pearl is a legend. Marine biologists have theorized about the possibility of pearls this size, but never anything proven." She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking. "I need to call the board. And security. And, oh my God, this is going to change everything." Within an hour, the museum was buzzing with activity despite the late hour. Security guards were posted, experts were called in, and documents were prepared. Samuel signed papers transferring custody of the pearl to the museum with the understanding that it would be displayed permanently with full credit to him as the discoverer. "We'll need to run tests," Dr. Martinez explained, her excitement barely contained. "Carbon dating, composition analysis, the works. But Mr. Rowe preliminary estimates, this pearl could be worth tens of millions of dollars. The museum will ensure you receive appropriate compensation, of course." Samuel shook his head. "I don't want money. I want it displayed where people can see it, wonder at it. I want a plaque with my name and my wife Ruth's name and my son Charlie's. They should be remembered too." Dr. Martinez looked at him strangely, but nodded. "Of course, whatever you wish." As Samuel and Leonard drove home in the early morning hours, the truck feeling empty without the pearl's weight, Samuel felt a mix of loss and relief. The pearl was safe now, protected where it could inspire wonder instead of greed. "You did the right thing," Leonard said. "But are you sure about the money you could have been set for life?" Samuel thought about it watching the sun rise over the Atlantic as they drove along the coastal road. "I've been thinking about that story my grandfather told, about how the men who found the dawn pearl before were destroyed by greed. Maybe the pearl isn't meant to be owned. Maybe it's meant to be shared to remind people that there's still magic in the world." That's awfully philosophical for a fisherman. Samuel smiled, the first real smile he'd managed in years. Maybe finding a magic pearl makes a man philosophical. When they reached Samuel's shack, they found evidence that Tommy and his crew had been their footprints everywhere. His workshop door forced open nets cut in what seemed like spite. But they hadn't found anything, and now they never would. Samuel stood on his porch looking out at the sea that had taken so much from him and finally given something back. He thought about Ruth, how she would have been proud of him for choosing wonder over wealth. He thought about Charlie, how excited he would have been to see his family's name in a museum. "Hey, Sam," Leonard said, joining him on the porch. "You realize you're going to be famous, right? The man who found the Dawn Pearl. Reporters are going to want to interview you. Scientists will want to study your discovery. Your quiet life is over." Samuel considered this, then shrugged. "Maybe it's time. I've been hiding from life for 23 years. Maybe the pearl wasn't just a gift from the sea. Maybe it was a wake-up call." Over the next few weeks, that prediction came true. The story of the Dawn Pearl, as the museum officially named it, spread across the country and then the world. Samuel gave interviews, always reluctantly, always steering the conversation back to the pearl itself rather than his own story. He insisted that every article mention Ruth and Charlie, keeping their memory alive in a way his solitary grief never could have. The museum's tests revealed the pearl was approximately 300 years old, formed in a species of clam thought to be extinct. Its size and perfection made it one of the most valuable pearls ever discovered, but its mysterious luminescence, which scientists couldn't fully explain, made it truly unique. Tommy Garrett tried to challenge Samuel's claim to the pearl, arguing that it had been found in public waters, but the law was clear. Samuel had discovered and retrieved it, making it legally his to donate as he wished. Tommy's reputation in town suffered when stories of his attempted intimidation came to light, and he eventually moved away chasing rumors of treasure somewhere else. Samuel used the modest finder's fee the museum insisted on giving him to repair his shack and the Ruth Marie. He didn't want luxury, he just wanted comfort in his remaining years. But more importantly, he used some of the money to establish a small scholarship fund at the local high school in Ruth and Charlie's names for students interested in marine biology. Dr. Martinez invited him to the grand unveiling of the Dawn Pearl exhibit. The museum had created an entire room for it with carefully controlled lighting that showcased the pearl's natural luminescence. The plaque beside it read, "The Dawn Pearl discovered by Samuel Rowe, dedicated to the memory of Ruth and Charlie Rowe, a reminder that the sea holds wonders beyond our imagination." Standing in that room, watching children press their faces against the glass in awe, watching adults fall silent in the presence of something genuinely magical, Samuel felt a peace he hadn't known in over 2 decades. The pearl continued to pulse with its mysterious light, and sometimes when the room was quiet, Samuel could swear he heard it humming, a sound like the sea itself, eternal and comforting. Months passed. The fame died down, though tourists still came to the museum specifically to see the Dawn Pearl. Samuel returned to his routine, but it felt different now. The weight of grief that had pressed down on him for so long had lifted not entirely, but enough that he could breathe again, could remember Ruth and Charlie with more joy than pain. He still fished, but now he sometimes took local kids out on the Ruth Marie, teaching them about the sea, telling them stories, including the true story of finding the Dawn Pearl. Their eyes would go wide with wonder, and Samuel would remember Charlie at that age, full of questions and dreams. One evening, almost a year after finding the pearl, Samuel sat on his porch watching the sunset. Leonard sat beside him, both men nursing beers and enjoying the comfortable silence of old friendship. "You ever regret it?" Leonard asked. "Giving up all that money?" Samuel thought about it, then shook his head. "The pearl gave me something more valuable than money. It gave me purpose again. It reminded me that life can still surprise you, even when you think all the surprises are behind you." "And the supposed curse," Samuel smiled. "Maybe the curse only applies to those who try to keep the pearl for themselves. I gave it away, shared it with the world. Maybe that broke the curse. Or maybe there never was a curse, just the ordinary greed and violence that comes when people fight over treasure." They sat in silence for a while, watching the waves. Then Leonard said, "You know, there are stories about other treasures out there. The emerald conch, the silver salmon that grants wishes, the golden net that never comes up empty. Fishermen's tales, Samuel said, but without dismissal. Maybe. Or maybe the sea has more gifts to give for those who know how to look. Samuel considered this watching the play of light on the water. Somewhere beneath those waves were mysteries that would never be solved, wonders that would never be discovered. But that was okay. He'd had his miracle, his moment of magic. It had been enough to bring him back to life, to reconnect him with the world, to give meaning to his remaining years. As darkness fell and the stars emerged, Samuel thought he saw a familiar copper glow in the distance just for a moment, like the pearl calling out to him from its new home. Or maybe it was just his imagination. Either way, it made him smile. He raised his beer toward the sea in a silent toast to Ruth and Charlie, to Leonard's friendship, to the pearl that had changed everything, and to the mysteries that still waited beneath the waves. The sea had taken everything from him once, but in its own time. In its own way, it had given him something back. Not just a pearl, but a reason to keep living, to keep wondering, to keep believing in the possibility of magic. "Tomorrow's supposed to be good weather," Leonard said. "Thought I might head out early, try that spot near the southern rocks. Want to come?" Samuel nodded. "Yeah, I'll come. Who knows, maybe we'll find another miracle. Or maybe we'll just catch some fish. That would be miracle enough." They sat there until full dark, two old fishermen who'd seen the impossible and lived to tell the tale. In the distance, the lighthouse began its nightly rotation, its beams sweeping across the water like a searching eye. And somewhere in Portland, in a climate-controlled room, the dawn pearl continued to glow, sharing its light with anyone who came to see it, a testament to the wonders that still existed in the world, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to look. Samuel went inside eventually, to the house that no longer felt quite so empty. On his nightstand, the photograph of Ruth and Charlie sat in its usual place, but now it was joined by a picture from the museum's opening, showing Samuel standing beside the pearl's display case, looking more alive than he had in 23 years. Before he slept, he whispered his nightly greeting to the photograph, but this time it felt different, less like talking to the dead, and more like sharing good news with family who were simply far away. "Found your treasure, Ruth," he said softly. "The one Grandpa always talked about. You would have loved it. Charlie would have asked 1,000 questions. And you know what? I gave it away, just like you would have wanted. It's out there now, making people believe in magic again." The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and for just a moment Samuel could swear he heard laughter in it. Ruth's laughter, bright and clear, as it had been on their wedding day, and Charlie's giggles from when Samuel would swing him up onto his shoulders. But maybe that was just the wind, or his imagination, or the residual magic of having touched something genuinely miraculous. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Samuel Rowe, a 72-year-old fisherman who'd lost everything to the sea, had found not just a pearl, but a way back to life. And tomorrow, he would go out on the water again, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because the sea still called to him, and because somewhere in its depths more wonders waited to be discovered. The dawn pearl had been just the beginning. The morning after his conversation with Leonard about other treasures, Samuel woke to find his small world had shifted again. A letter had been slipped under his door during the night, expensive paper with an embossed seal he didn't recognize. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, remembering the last time unexpected correspondence had changed his life. The insurance papers after Ruth and Charlie's deaths, but this letter brought different news. It was from Eleanor Blackwood, a wealthy collector from Boston who claimed to have information about his grandfather, specifically about the man who had told his grandfather the story of the Dawn Pearl all those years ago. "Mr. Rowe," the letter read in elegant handwriting. "I have followed with great interest your discovery of the Dawn Pearl. My great-grandfather Cornelius Blackwood was a maritime merchant who knew your grandfather well. Among his papers, I have found references to their friendship and to certain unusual events they witnessed together. I believe you might find these documents illuminating. Would you consider meeting with me? I will be in Portland next Tuesday." Samuel read the letter 3 times each, reading making him more uneasy. Why now? Why had this woman waited until after the pearl was safely in the museum to make contact? He called Leonard, who came over immediately bringing coffee and his natural skepticism. "Could be a scam," Leonard said. examining the letter. Rich people always think they're connected to every story somehow. Maybe, Samuel agreed, but something nagged at him. His grandfather had been secretive about certain aspects of his past, especially his younger years working the merchant ships. But what if she actually knows something? Only one way to find out, but I'm coming with you. The following Tuesday found them in the lobby of Portland's finest hotel, feeling out of place in their clean but worn clothing among the marble and crystal. Eleanor Blackwood was nothing like Samuel had expected. Instead of some elderly matron, she was perhaps 50 with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. "Mr. Rowe, Mr. Pike," she greeted them warmly. "Thank you for coming. Shall we talk somewhere more private?" She led them to a private dining room she had reserved where tea was already waiting. Once they were seated, she pulled out a leather portfolio filled with aged documents. "My great-grandfather was not a good man," she began without preamble. "He made his fortune in ways I'm not proud of, but he was meticulous about keeping records, and among them I found these." She spread several documents on the table. There were shipping manifest diary entries and, most remarkably, a photograph from 1952 showing Samuel's grandfather as a young man standing next to another man on a dock. Between them was something covered in canvas, but the shape was unmistakably similar to the clam Samuel had found. "That's impossible," Samuel breathed. "My grandfather found another one." "Not found," Eleanor corrected. "According to Cornelius's diary, they discovered it together but fought over what to do with it. Your grandfather wanted to return it to the sea, believing the old stories about curses. Cornelius wanted to sell it. In the end," she pulled out another document, a faded newspaper clipping. "There was an accident. Cornelius's ship sank in calm weather, all hands lost except him. He survived but never went to sea again, and your grandfather never spoke of it." Samuel stared at the documents, his mind reeling. His grandfather had actually experienced the truth of the Dawn Pearl, yet had only told it as a story, a legend. "There's more," Eleanor continued. "Cornelius wrote that your grandfather believed these pearls appear once every 73 years, always to someone who has suffered great loss at sea. He called them the sea's apology, its way of making amends for the lives it takes." 73 years, Leonard calculated quickly. 1952 to now, that's 73 years. Eleanor nodded. "I don't believe in curses, Mr. Rowe, but I do believe in patterns, and I believe you were meant to find that pearl just as your grandfather was meant to find his. The difference is you made the right choice. You gave it away." She pulled out one final document, a letter in his grandfather's handwriting. Samuel recognized it immediately, the same careful script he remembered from birthday cards and fishing logs. "This was never sent," Eleanor explained. "Cornelius kept it. I think your grandfather intended it for you." With shaking hands, Samuel read, "To my grandson Samuel, if the sea ever gives you its gift, and I pray it never does, for it means you've lost something precious. Know this, the pearl is not meant to be owned. It's meant to heal, to remind us that even in our deepest grief, wonder still exists. I failed to convince Cornelius of this, and good men died for it. Don't repeat my mistake. The sea remembers everything, Samuel. Treat its gifts with respect, and it will respect you in return. All my love, grandfather." Samuel had to set the letter down, his vision blurring with unexpected tears. All those years, his grandfather had carried this secret, this guilt. And somehow, across decades, his message had finally reached its intended recipient. "Why are you showing me this?" Samuel asked Eleanor when he could speak again. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Because I've spent my life trying to make amends for my family's sins. Cornelius's greed caused deaths, including nearly your grandfather's. When I read about your discovery about how you donated it to the museum, I knew I had to share this with you. You did what they couldn't, you chose wonder over wealth. But there's something else," she added, reaching into her bag. "Something I thought you should have." She pulled out a small box, ancient-looking and water-stained. Inside, cushioned in faded velvet, was a pearl the size of a walnut. It didn't glow like the Dawn Pearl, but it had a deep luster that seemed to shift from silver to gold as the light hit it. "Cornelius kept this," Eleanor explained. "He cut it from the giant pearl before the ship sank. It was the only piece that survived. I think your grandfather would want you to have it." Samuel stared at the smaller pearl, understanding flooding through him. This was a piece of history, a connection to his grandfather's secret past. He picked it up carefully, and though it didn't pulse with light like its larger cousin, he felt something, a warmth, a sense of connection across time. "Thank you," he said simply. Eleanor smiled. "There's one more thing. I've been researching these pearls, tracking stories and legends. I believe there are more signs to watch for, patterns that suggest when and where they might appear. If you're interested—" "No," Samuel said firmly, then softened his tone. "Thank you, but no. I've had my miracle. Let someone else have theirs." They parted cordially, Eleanor leaving copies of the documents for Samuel to keep. As he and Leonard drove back to the coast, the smaller pearl safe in Samuel's pocket, neither man spoke for a long while. Finally, Leonard said, "Your grandfather was quite a man, carrying that secret all those years." "He was trying to protect me," Samuel realized. "He told me the story as a fairy tale so I'd know about it without believing it was real. But when it became real, you knew what to do." That night, Samuel placed the smaller pearl on his mantle where it caught the firelight and seemed to glow with its own inner flame. He sat in his chair, the one Ruth had bought him for his 40th birthday, and thought about patterns, about cycles, about the sea's long memory. The next few weeks brought an unexpected consequence of Eleanor's revelations. Word had somehow gotten out. Perhaps Eleanor had been less discreet than she'd seemed about the 73-year cycle, about the connection between the pearls and grief. Samuel started receiving letters, emails, even visits from people who had lost loved ones to the sea, all wanting to know the secret, the location, the trick to finding their own dawn pearl. "It doesn't work that way." Samuel tried to explain to a young widow who showed up at his door one evening, her eyes red from crying. Her husband had been lost in a fishing accident just 3 months ago. "I wasn't looking for it. It just appeared." "But you must have done something," she insisted. "Some ritual, some prayer. Please, I just need to know he didn't die for nothing." Samuel invited her in, made her tea, and told her the truth. That sometimes the sea takes and never gives back. That most grief doesn't come with magical pearls to soften it. But he also told her about the museum, about taking her children to see the dawn pearl, about finding wonder even in loss. She left disappointed but less desperate, and Samuel realized he had inadvertently become something he'd never wanted to be: a keeper of other people's grief, a lighthouse for the lost and sorrowful. "You could charge for these consultations," Leonard joked one afternoon after the 4th visitor of the week had left. "Become one of those grief counselors." "God forbid," Samuel muttered. "I can barely handle my own grief." But that wasn't entirely true anymore. Something had shifted in him since finding the pearl, since learning about his grandfather's secret. The weight of loss was still there, would always be there, but it no longer defined him entirely. He could think of Ruth and Charlie now, and smile sometimes, remembering the good moments without immediately drowning in the bad. One evening, a month after meeting Eleanor, Samuel was closing up his workshop when he noticed something odd. The smaller pearl on his mantle was glowing not dramatically like the dawn pearl had, but with a subtle pulse that hadn't been there before. He approached it cautiously, and as he got closer, he could hear something faint as a whisper, the sound of waves, but not the waves outside his door. These were different, older, somehow carrying voices just below the threshold of understanding. He picked up the pearl, and immediately the sound grew louder. Not louder in his ears, but in his mind, in his bones. And suddenly, he understood something his grandfather had tried to tell him in that unsent letter. The pearls weren't just treasures. They were memories, crystallized grief, and wonder made solid by time and pressure, and the sea's strange alchemy. The front door burst open, making Samuel nearly drop the pearl. Tommy Garrett stood there, but not the Tommy who had left town in disgrace. This Tommy looked haggard, desperate, his clothes salt-stained and his eyes wild. "I know you have another one," he said, his voice rough. "I've been watching. That woman from Boston, she brought you something. I need it, Sam." "Tommy, what are you doing here? You need to leave." "My son," Tommy said, and his voice broke. "My son, Danny. There was an accident. His boat. They can't find him. 3 days now. The Coast Guard's given up, but I know he's out there. I need the pearl, Sam. I need its luck, its magic, whatever it is. Please." Samuel hadn't even known Tommy had a son. The man had always been a loner, focused on profit over people, but the raw pain in his voice was unmistakable. The pearl can't bring him back, Tommy. It doesn't work like that. You don't know what it can do. Tommy pulled out a knife, not threatening, but desperate, using it to gesture wildly. The stories say it grants wishes that it controls the sea. I'll pay you. I'll do anything. Just let me borrow it. Samuel thought of his own loss of the bargains he would have made with any power that would listen in those first terrible days after Ruth and Charlie died. He understood Tommy's desperation, even as he knew how futile it was. Put the knife down, Tommy. Let me help you. You can't help? No one can help unless… Tommy's words were cut off by the sound of a siren. Not a police siren, but the harbor's emergency signal. Both men froze, recognizing what it meant. A boat was coming in with survivors. Tommy turned and ran, heading for the harbor. Samuel followed, still clutching the small pearl without realizing it. They reached the dock as the Coast Guard cutter was pulling in. Samuel could see figures on deck wrapped in blankets, and one of them, young, shaking but alive, was Danny Garrett. Tommy let out a sound that was part sob, part scream, and rushed forward as his son was helped off the boat. Samuel stood back, watching father and son reunite, and felt the pearl pulse warm in his hand. Coincidence, surely. The Coast Guard had found Danny on their own, following currents and search patterns. The pearl had nothing to do with it. But as he walked home, Samuel wondered. His grandfather had written that the sea remembers everything. Maybe it remembered Tommy's desperation, Samuel's compassion, the complex web of human connections that tied all coastal people together. Maybe the small pearl fragment of a larger miracle carried just enough magic for small mercies. When he got home, he found Leonard waiting on his porch with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. Heard about Danny Garrett, Leonard said. Hell of a thing. Yeah. They drank in silence for a while, watching the stars appear. Then Leonard said, You know, ever since you found that pearl, things have been different around here. Can't put my finger on it, but it's like the town's luck has changed. Better catches, fewer accidents. Even the weather's been kinder. That's just coincidence. Maybe. Or maybe when you gave the pearl to the museum, when you chose to share it instead of hoard it, you changed something. Broke a pattern of greed and loss that had been building for who knows how long. Samuel considered this, rolling the small pearl between his fingers. It had cooled now, feeling like ordinary pearl, but he knew better than to trust appearances. Over the following days, Tommy came by twice to thank him, though for what neither man could quite articulate. The second time he brought Danny with him, a quiet young man who looked at Samuel with something approaching awe. I heard voices, Danny said suddenly, interrupting his father's rambling gratitude. When I was in the water after the boat went down, I was about to give up, let go, and then I heard voices telling me to hold on, that help was coming. They sounded like the sea itself was talking. Tommy looked embarrassed by his son's words, but Samuel just nodded. The sea has many voices. I'm glad you listened to the right ones. After they left, Samuel made a decision. He took the small pearl and walked down to the dock to the exact spot where he launched each morning. The sun was setting, turning the water to molten gold, and the conditions were perfect calm, but not still clear, but with that quality of light that makes the ordinary world seem touched by something greater. He held the pearl up, watching the light play through it, then drew his arm back to throw it into the sea. But something stopped him. Not greed, not attachment, but a sense that the pearl's work wasn't done. It had more memories to make, more small mercies to enable. Instead, he walked to the workshop and retrieved his tools. Working carefully through the night, he fashioned a simple setting for the pearl, turning it into a pendant on a strong chain. It wasn't fancy work. Samuel was a fisherman, not a jeweler, but it was solid and true. The next morning, he drove to the museum in Portland. Dr. Martinez was surprised to see him, but welcomed him warmly. I have something for the exhibit, Samuel said, producing the pendant. A companion piece to the Dawn Pearl. He told her the story Eleanor had shared, showed her the documents, explained the connection between the 2 pearls. Dr. Martinez's eyes grew wide with excitement. This is incredible, the historical documentation alone. And to have a piece of the original pearl your grandfather found. Mr. Rowe, this is an invaluable addition to the exhibit. There's one condition, Samuel said. I want it displayed where people can touch it. Touch it, but the oils from hands, the potential damage. It's meant to be touched. The Dawn Pearl is for wonder, for looking and dreaming. This smaller pearl is for connection, for remembering that we're all linked by loss and hope. Let people hold it just for a moment. Let them make their wishes and speak their grief. The pearl can handle it. Dr. Martinez looked skeptical, but she saw something in Samuel's eyes that made her nod. We'll need to design a special display, something that allows contact while maintaining security. It won't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is. It took 3 months to redesign the exhibit. During that time, Samuel returned to his routine, but with a difference. He started taking people out on his boat, not for money, but for the experience. Families who had lost someone to the sea, children who had never been on the water, elderly folks who wanted one more sunrise voyage. The Ruth Marie became a vessel of pilgrimage, and Samuel its unlikely captain priest. One morning, he took out a group of school children, their teacher having contacted him after hearing about his informal tours. As they motored out into the bay, a little girl named Emma, perhaps 7 years old, tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Samuel, is it true you found a magic pearl?" "I found a pearl. Whether it was magic, well, what do you think magic is?" Emma considered this seriously. "My mom says magic is when good things happen that you can't explain." "Then, yes, I found a magic pearl." "Will I find one too?" Samuel looked at her earnest face, then out at the vast sea. "Maybe not a pearl, but if you keep your eyes and heart open, you'll find your own magic. It might be a perfect shell or a friend when you need one, or a moment when everything makes sense. The sea's full of different kinds of treasures." The girl nodded solemnly and spent the rest of the trip scanning the water with intense concentration. She didn't find a pearl, but she saw dolphins, and the joy on her face was treasure enough. The reopening of the exhibit was a major event. The museum had created an alcove within the Dawn Pearl Room where the smaller pearl pendant hung at chest height, secured but accessible. A plaque beside it read, "The Memory Pearl, a fragment of wonder meant to be shared. Touch gently and remember we are all connected by the tides of love and loss." Samuel stood in the back during the opening, watching people approach the pendant hesitantly, then reach out to touch it. Some closed their eyes, lips moving in silent prayer or wish. Others simply held it for a moment, as if drawing strength from its smooth surface. A few cried, and Samuel understood sometimes touching something real, something that had survived loss and transformation, gave permission to feel what had been held inside. An elderly woman approached him, having recognized him from the newspaper photos. "My husband was in the Merchant Marine," she said softly. "Lost at sea in 1971. I never had a grave to visit, never had a place to say goodbye. But touching that pearl, knowing it came from the sea, from the same waters that took him, it helped. Thank you." Samuel just nodded, his throat too tight for words. As the months passed, the memory pearl became a phenomenon of its own. People traveled from across the country to touch it, to make their wishes, to connect with something larger than their individual grief. The museum started collecting the stories people were willing to share, creating a book of remembrance that sat near the display. Tommy Garrett came with Danny, and Samuel watched from a distance as the formerly hard man touched the pearl with unexpected gentleness, his son's hand on his shoulder. Whatever Tommy wished for or remembered in that moment softened something in his face, and when he left, he nodded to Samuel with genuine respect. Leonard brought Helen, and she held the pearl for a long moment before turning to Samuel with tears in her eyes. "I lost a baby," she said quietly, "before Leonard and I married. I never told anyone except him. But this pearl, it's like it knows, like it holds all our secret sorrows and says it's okay to have carried them." Even Dr. Martinez, the scientific skeptic, admitted there was something unusual about the pearl. "The number of people who report feeling different after touching it is statistically significant," she told Samuel. "I can't explain it scientifically, but I can't deny the impact it's having." One day, almost a year after the exhibit reopened, Samuel received another letter. This one was from a marine biologist in Japan, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who had been studying unusual pearl formations in the Pacific. Mr. Rowe. Rowe, the letter read. "I have been following your discovery with great interest. In my research, I have found references to similar pearls in Japanese folklore, the tears of Ryujin, the dragon god of the sea. According to legend, these pearls appear to those who have shown the sea proper respect in the face of great loss. I have documented 3 potential appearances in the last 219 years, exactly 3 cycles of 73 years. I believe what you found is part of a global phenomenon, a way the ocean itself responds to human grief and resilience. Samuel shared the letter with Dr. Martinez, who immediately began corresponding with Dr. Tanaka. The scientific community was buzzing with theories, but Samuel found he cared less about explanations than effects. The pearl. Both pearls were doing what they were meant to do, bringing wonder, enabling connection, transforming grief into something bearable, even beautiful. 3 years passed. Samuel continued his life fishing, giving tours, visiting the museum regularly to see how the pearls were touching lives. He was 75 now, moving slower but still strong, still called by the sea each morning. One autumn evening, he was sitting on his porch when a young woman approached carrying a baby and leading a toddler by the hand. She looked familiar, but Samuel couldn't place her until she smiled. It was Emma, the little girl from the school tour, grown up now. "Mr. Samuel, I don't know if you remember me." "Emma, of course I remember. You were looking for magic." She laughed. "I found it too, different than I expected." She introduced her children, then said, "I became a marine biologist because of that day on your boat. I study the organisms that create pearls, and I wanted to thank you for showing me that science and wonder aren't opposites, that magic can be real even when you understand how it works." They talked for a while, Emma, sharing her research. Her theory that the pearls were created by a combination of specific water conditions, rare mollusks and trace minerals that occurred in predictable but extremely rare patterns. "It's still magic," she insisted. "Just magic we can begin to understand." After she left, Samuel sat alone watching the stars emerge. He thought about cycles, about patterns, about the way loss and wonder seemed to dance together through time. His grandfather had kept his secret to protect Samuel from the burden of knowledge. Samuel had shared his secret to transform that burden into a gift. The small pearl, the memory pearl, had touched thousands of lives now. The museum had started a tradition every year on the anniversary of the Dawn Pearl's discovery. They held a ceremony where people could share stories of what they'd lost to the sea and what the sea had given back. Samuel always attended but never spoke, preferring to listen to the tapestry of grief and grace that wove through people's lives. One story particularly moved him, a young man whose father had been a fisherman, lost when the boy was 10. The boy had grown up hating the sea, but touching the memory pearl had given him a different perspective. "I realized the sea didn't take him out of malice," the young man said. "It was just being the sea. And the same sea that took him has fed families, inspired artists, connected continents. My father died doing what he loved where he belonged. The pearl helped me see that." As Samuel walked home that night, he passed the harbor where the Ruth Marie bobbed at her mooring. On impulse, he climbed aboard, started the engine, and headed out into the dark water. The moon was full, laying a silver path across the waves, and the night was so clear he could see the Milky Way arching overhead. He cut the engine a mile out and sat in the sudden silence. Then from his pocket, he pulled out a small object he'd been carrying for weeks. Another pearl. This one tiny, no bigger than a pea, that had appeared in his net that morning. It didn't glow, didn't pulse with mysterious light, but Samuel knew what it was. The sea's way of saying the cycle continued. He held it up to the moonlight, then gently dropped it over the side. "For someone else," he said to the waves. "Someone who needs it more than me." As he started the engine to head home, he thought he saw something in the water, a brief flash of copper light there, and gone so quickly he couldn't be sure it was real. But real or not, it made him smile. The sea had its secrets still, its treasures waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right kind of loss that could be transformed into wonder. Back at his shack, Samuel made his nightly ritual of greeting Ruth and Charlie's photograph, but tonight he added something new. "The story continues," he told them. "Different players, same sea, same mix of sorrow and magic. You would have loved seeing how many people have been touched by what we found. Charlie, you would have had so many questions. Ruth, you would have known exactly what to say to all those grieving folks who came looking for hope." He prepared for bed, his body tired, but his spirit surprisingly light. Tomorrow he would fish. Tomorrow he might take another group of children out to look for dolphins and dreams. Tomorrow the museum would open and people would touch the memory pearl and make their wishes. Tomorrow, somewhere in the vast ocean, another pearl might be forming layer by layer, building toward its own moment of discovery. But tonight, Samuel Rowe slept peacefully, no longer haunted by what the sea had taken, finally at peace with what it had given back. In his dreams, he heard voices. Ruth's laugh, Charlie's questions, his grandfather's stories, Leonard's jokes, and underneath it all, the eternal sound of waves against the shore, the sea's own voice speaking its ancient language of loss and return, taking and giving endings and beginnings without end. The dawn pearl glowed in its museum case. The memory pearl hung ready for tomorrow's pilgrims, and in the depths of the ocean, carried by currents older than memory seeds of wonder, drifted through the dark water waiting for their time to rise. The next morning brought an unexpected storm, the kind that materialized without warning, and sent even experienced fishermen scrambling for harbor. Samuel had just finished securing the Ruth Marie when he noticed a figure standing at the end of the dock, seemingly oblivious to the driving rain and wind. As he approached, he realized it was a woman he'd never seen before, elderly but standing straight, despite the gale, her eyes fixed on the churning sea. "Ma'am, you need to get inside," Samuel called over the wind. "This storm's getting worse." She turned to him, and he saw she was crying, though the rain masked her tears. "My granddaughter," she said, her voice barely audible. "She's out there. The Sarah's Dream. They lost radio contact an hour ago." Samuel's blood ran cold. He knew the Sarah's Dream, a small research vessel that often went out to collect samples for the Marine Laboratory. In seas like this, a boat that size would be in serious trouble. The Coast Guard. "They can't launch in this weather, said to wait until it calms." The woman grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You're Samuel Rowe. You found the pearl. You understand the sea. Please." Samuel looked at the mountainous waves beyond the harbor, then back at the woman's desperate face. It was madness to go out in this storm. But he thought of Ruth and Charlie, of how the sea had taken them while he was safe on land, helpless. He thought of the promises he'd made to himself about never being helpless again. "What's your name?" he asked. Margaret Chen. My granddaughter is Lynn. She's 23, Mr. Rowe. She's all I have left." Samuel made his decision. "Leonard," he shouted toward the harbor master's office. Leonard emerged, took one look at Samuel's face, and shook his head. "Don't even think about it, Sam. The Sarah's Dream is out there. Young woman aboard." Leonard's expression changed. They both knew what it meant when a small boat went silent in a storm like this. "You can't take the Ruth Marie out in this. She'll break apart." "Not the Ruth Marie," Samuel said. "The persistent dream. She's bigger, stronger. You coming?" Leonard looked at him like he was insane, then sighed. "Helen's going to kill me. But yeah, I'm coming." They ran to Leonard's larger trawler, Margaret following despite Samuel's protests that she should wait on shore. "I'm coming," she said with steel in her voice. "I won't lose another one to the sea while I wait on land." Samuel understood that feeling too well to argue further. They threw on life jackets and emergency gear while Leonard fired up the engines. As they pulled away from the dock, Samuel saw other fishermen watching from the harbor office, their faces grim. Some raised their hands in farewell, or perhaps goodbye. The moment they left the harbor's protection, the storm hit them like a physical force. The persistent dream climbed waves that towered above them, then plunged into troughs that made Samuel's stomach lurch. Margaret clung to a secured seat in the cabin, her lips moving in what might have been prayer, while Leonard fought the wheel, and Samuel tried to calculate where the Sarah's Dream might have drifted. "They were studying the kelp beds near Seal Point," Margaret managed to say. Lynn said they'd found something unusual. Seal Point was 5 miles out in waters that would be treacherous even in good weather. In this storm with the rocks and reefs around the point, it was a death trap. They fought through the storm for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. Samuel's eyes burned from straining to see through the rain and spray, searching for any sign of the research vessel. The radio crackled with Coast Guard updates they still couldn't launch, urged any vessels in the area to return to port immediately. "There," Leonard shouted suddenly, pointing through the windscreen. Samuel saw it, a flash of orange that might have been a life jacket or emergency buoy. They altered course, fighting the wind and current that wanted to push them onto the rocks. As they got closer, they could see the Sarah's Dream, or what was left of it. The boat was on its side, waves breaking over it, clearly taking on water. 3 figures clung to the hull, and even from a distance, Samuel could see they wouldn't last much longer. "We can't get too close," Leonard said. "The waves will smash us into them, or onto the rocks." Samuel was already pulling on the emergency rescue harness. "Hold her as steady as you can. I'm going in." "Sam, no, you're 75 years old." "And I'm the strongest swimmer here," Samuel said, which was probably true despite his age. Decades of diving for lost gear and fouled lines had kept him in shape. "Margaret, there's a rescue line in that locker. When I signal, you and Leonard pull like your life depends on it." Before anyone could protest further, Samuel was over the side and into the maelstrom. The cold hit him like a sledgehammer, driving the breath from his lungs. The waves tossed him like a toy, and for a moment he thought he'd made a terrible mistake. But then his training kicked in, muscle memory from 50 years of working these waters. He swam with the storm instead of against it, using the wave patterns to carry him toward the capsized boat. The first person he reached was a young man barely conscious, his grip on the hull failing. Samuel grabbed him, secured him to the rescue line, and gave the signal. The line went taut as Leonard and Margaret pulled, dragging the young man through the water toward the persistent Dream. Samuel went back for the second figure, a middle-aged woman who was trying to hold up the third person, a young Asian woman who had to be Lynn. The older woman looked at Samuel with desperate eyes. "Take her first," she gasped. "I can hold on." Samuel knew she couldn't not for another trip, but he also knew Lynn was unconscious and needed immediate help. He made the brutal decision, securing Lynn to his harness and signaling for retrieval. As they were pulled away, he heard the other woman cry out, saw her grip fail, saw her disappear into the churning water. "No." Samuel released Lynn at the boat's edge where Leonard hauled her aboard, then dove back toward where the woman had gone under. The waves threw him against the capsized hull, splitting his forehead open, blood streaming into his eyes. But there a flash of color beneath the surface. He dove his lungs, screaming, his aged body protesting, and his fingers found cloth, then an arm. He pulled with everything he had, breaking the surface just as his vision started to go black. Somehow, he got the woman secured to the line. Somehow, he held on as they were pulled to safety. Somehow, he climbed the ladder Leonard threw down, though his legs felt like water, and his hands were numb. He collapsed on the deck as Leonard gunned the engines, racing for harbor as the storm reached its full fury. Margaret was performing CPR on Lynn, tears streaming down her face. The young man was conscious but in shock, and the older woman Samuel had pulled from the water was coughing up seawater, but alive. Samuel tried to stand to help, but his body finally rebelled. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was a strange copper light in the water behind them, like the dawn pearl, calling from the depths, or perhaps just his oxygen-deprived brain creating miracles where there were none. He woke in the hospital, machines beeping around him, his body feeling like it had been beaten with hammers. Leonard sat in a chair beside his bed, looking haggard. "You damn fool," Leonard said when he saw Samuel's eyes open. "You nearly died. Doctor said if you were anyone else your age, you would have—" "The girl Lynn. Alive. All 3 of them are alive, thanks to you." Leonard's voice broke slightly. "That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen, Sam." "Had to," Samuel croaked, his throat raw from the seawater he'd swallowed. "Couldn't stand on shore again while the sea took someone." Leonard understood. He squeezed Samuel's shoulder gently. "Margaret's been here every day. Lynn too, once she was able. You've been out for 3 days. 3 days. Samuel tried to process this. The storm. Passed the next morning. Coast Guard found debris from the Sarah's Dream, but said there's no way anyone could have survived if we hadn't been there. Leonard paused. "Sam, there's something else. Lynn says she saw something when she was unconscious. A light under the water, copper-colored, pulsing like a heartbeat. She says it led her back, kept her from letting go." Samuel remembered his own glimpse of that light, but before he could respond, the door opened and Margaret Chen entered, followed by a young woman who had to be Lynn. The family resemblance was strong, but where Margaret was all sharp angles and steel will, Lynn had a softer presence, though her eyes held depths that spoke of her recent brush with death. "Mr. Rowe," Lynn said, her voice barely above a whisper. You saved my life. You risked everything for strangers. Not strangers, Samuel said. People in trouble on the sea. That makes you family in a way. Margaret was crying again, but smiling through her tears. The doctors said you shouldn't have been able to do what you did. A man your age in those conditions, they're calling it miraculous. Samuel thought about miracles about pearls and patterns about the sea's long memory. Maybe the sea owed me one, he said quietly. Lynn stepped forward, pulling something from her pocket. I need to tell you something. The reason we were out there, what we found. She held out her hand and Samuel's breath caught. It was a pearl. Not massive like the dawn pearl, not even as large as the memory pearl, but unmistakably from the same family. It glowed with that familiar copper light, though faintly as if exhausted from recent effort. We found it in the kelp beds, Lynn explained. Dr. Morrison wanted to study it immediately, didn't want to return to port despite the weather warnings. I think it saved us. When I was drowning, I felt it pulling me up, keeping me conscious just long enough. Samuel stared at the pearl, his mind racing. Another one appearing just as someone needed it most. The pattern continuing the sea's strange gift manifesting again. What will you do with it? He asked. Lynn looked at her grandmother, then back at Samuel. I wanted to ask your advice. You understand these pearls better than anyone. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, then said, The pearl chose you, Lynn. You were meant to find it just as I was meant to find mine. The question is, what does your heart tell you to do? Lynn closed her fingers around the pearl, and Samuel saw her decide. There's a children's hospital in Portland. Kids who've lost parents in maritime accidents. I think they need to see that magic exists, that loss isn't the end of the story. Samuel smiled, feeling a deep satisfaction. The pattern would continue. The pearls would keep appearing, each one teaching the same lesson in different ways, that grief and wonder were not opposites, but partners that the sea took, but also gave, that sometimes the greatest treasure was not keeping something, but knowing when to let it go. Over the following weeks, as Samuel recovered, the story of the rescue spread. The press called him a hero, but Samuel deflected the attention to Leonard and Margaret to the Coast Guard, who'd been preparing to launch despite the danger to the community that had come together in crisis. But privately, he knew something had changed in him during those moments in the storm. The fear he'd carried for 23 years, the fear of the sea's power to take what he loved, had transformed into something else. A respect that went deeper than fear, an understanding that he was part of the sea's story just as it was part of his. Lynn donated her pearl to the children's hospital, where it was displayed in a special room where young grievers could go to sit and think and heal. She started visiting regularly, telling the children about the storm, about being saved, about how sometimes help comes from unexpected places. She was studying to become a marine biologist, specializing in pearl formation, working with Dr. Tanaka in Japan to understand the phenomenon. One day she came to visit Samuel at his shack, bringing a thick folder of research. We found records of 17 pearls over the last 300 years, she said excitedly. Always appearing to someone who's experienced loss at sea, always in times of great need. But here's the interesting part, the pearls seem to be connected. Chemical analysis shows they all have the same unique mineral signature, as if they're all from the same source. The same giant clam. Possibly, or perhaps something bigger. Dr. Tanaka has a theory that there's a massive pearl bed somewhere in the deep ocean, a place where grief and pressure and time have created something unprecedented. He thinks individual pearls break off and rise to the surface when the conditions are right. Samuel thought about this, imagining some vast treasure in the deep, waiting to heal humanity's wounds one pearl at a time. It was fantastical, impossible, and yet no more impossible than what he'd already experienced. Are you going to look for it? He asked. Lynn shook her head. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, but we are tracking patterns trying to predict when and where the next pearl might appear. Not to harvest them, but to understand them, maybe to help them find the people who need them most. After she left, Samuel walked down to his dock where the Ruth Marie waited patiently. His body was still recovering from the rescue, moving slower than before, but he climbed aboard with determination. The boat purred to life, and he headed out into calm waters very different from that terrible storm. He anchored at the spot where he'd found the dawn pearl, though the giant clam was long gone, taken to the museum for study after the pearl's removal. The water was clear enough to see the bottom, just rocks and swaying kelp, ordinary and peaceful. But as he sat there, Samuel felt a presence not threatening, but watchful, as if the sea itself was taking his measure. He pulled out a small object he'd been carrying, a photograph of Ruth and Charlie, weatherproofed and worn from years of handling. "I'm going to leave this here," he said to the waves. "Not because I'm letting you go, but because you're part of this place now, part of the sea's memory. And maybe when the next person finds a pearl, a little bit of your love will be in it." He dropped the photograph into the water, watched it sink slowly, catching the light as it descended. For a moment he thought he saw that copper glow again surrounding the photograph like an embrace, but it might have been the sun on the water playing tricks on his tired eyes. When he returned to harbor, Leonard was waiting with news. "Remember Tommy Garrett? He's back in town but different. His son Danny wants to start a nonprofit, using boats to take troubled kids out on the water, teaching them fishing and respect for the sea. They want to know if you'll help." Samuel thought about Tommy, about how near loss had changed him, about patterns of redemption playing out across the coast. "Tell them yes," he said. The nonprofit launched 6 months later with Samuel as an advisory board member and frequent volunteer. He watched Tommy work with the kids, patient where he'd once been, harsh, generous where he'd once been grasping. Danny had become an advocate for marine conservation, his near-death experience having given him a sense of mission. "The sea gave me back my life," Danny told the kids on their first day. "Not going to waste that gift." One of the boys, maybe 12, angry and closed off from losing his father in a fishing accident, asked, "How do you know it was a gift? Maybe you just got lucky." Danny looked at Samuel, who nodded encouragement. "Maybe luck and gifts are the same thing," Danny said. "What matters is what you do with them." The boy wasn't convinced, but he kept coming back week after week, slowly opening up on the water in ways he couldn't on land. Samuel saw it happen with others too. Children who'd lost parents to the sea, slowly making peace with it, learning that the ocean wasn't evil, just vast and indifferent, and occasionally impossibly generous. Dr. Martinez invited Samuel to speak at a symposium about the pearls. Scientists from around the world had gathered to discuss the phenomenon, presenting theories ranging from the geological to the mystical. Samuel sat through presentations on crystalline structures and oceanic pressures, on folklore and psychology, feeling increasingly out of place among the academics. When his turn came to speak, he stood at the podium looking out at the expectant faces and spoke from his heart. "You want to understand the pearls scientifically, and that's good, important work. But I can only tell you what I know from experience. The pearls appear when they're needed most to people who have lost the most. They don't fix anything. My wife and son are still gone." Lynn's experience in the storm was still terrifying. Every person who's touched the memory pearl still carries their grief. But the pearls remind us that beauty can come from pain, that the universe hasn't forgotten us, that wonder still exists even in our darkest moments. He paused, seeing some skeptical faces, but also many thoughtful ones. "I don't know if the pearls are conscious or if we just project consciousness onto them. I don't know if the sea really remembers or if we just need to believe it does. But I know that since these pearls have been appearing, people have been healing. Not forgetting, not moving on, but healing. And maybe that's miracle enough." The symposium ended without consensus, but Samuel noticed something interesting. Several of the scientists approached him privately, sharing their own stories of loss and wondering if perhaps there was more to the universe than what could be measured and categorized. Years passed. Samuel aged, moving from 75 to 80, his body slowly betraying him even as his spirit remained strong. He couldn't take the Ruth Marie out alone anymore, but he still visited her daily, maintaining her with the help of younger fishermen who'd adopted him as an unofficial grandfather. The Dawn Pearl continued to draw visitors to the museum, and the Memory Pearl had been touched by thousands of hands, each leaving a bit of their story behind. Lynn's pearl at the Children's Hospital had become a beacon for young grievers, and 3 more pearls had been discovered, one by a widow in Alaska, one by a tsunami survivor in Japan, and one by a Coast Guard rescuer who'd lost his partner in a rescue attempt. Each pearl found its way to where it was needed most, the finders seeming to understand instinctively that these treasures weren't meant to be hoarded. The museum had created a pearl registry, documenting each discovery, each story, creating a map of grief and grace across the world's oceans. Samuel was sitting on his porch one evening watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pearl when Leonard joined him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two old men who'd seen wonders and survived storms before Leonard spoke. "Helen passed this morning," he said quietly. Samuel's heart clenched. Helen had been fighting cancer for 2 years, fighting it with the same stubborn grace she'd brought to 60 years of marriage. "I'm so sorry, Leo." "She was ready," Leonard said, tears running down his weathered cheeks. "Said she'd had a good life, full life. But Sam, at the end she asked me to bring her to the museum, to the memory pearl. She held it and smiled, said she could feel all the love that had been poured into it over the years. Said death didn't seem so scary, knowing she was joining that great ocean of love." They sat together as darkness fell, two old fishermen bound by decades of friendship and loss. Finally, Leonard said, "I want to take her ashes out to where you found the dawn pearl. Seems fitting somehow." "We'll go together," Samuel promised. They went out the next week, joined by Lynn and Margaret, by Tommy and Danny Garrett, by Dr. Martinez and several others whose lives had been touched by the pearls. It was a calm day, the sea gentle as if in respect. Leonard scattered Helen's ashes while everyone shared memories, and just as the last of the ashes touched the water, a pod of dolphins surfaced nearby, their sleek bodies catching the light as they swam through Helen's remains, carrying her out to sea. "She would have loved that," Leonard said, managing a smile through his tears. As they headed back to harbor, Lynn pulled Samuel aside. "I've been tracking the patterns," she said quietly. "If Dr. Tanaka's calculations are correct, we're approaching another 73-year cycle. There might be another major pearl discovery soon." Samuel looked out at the vast ocean, thinking about cycles and patterns, about who might need the next pearl and what story it would tell. "Let it come to who needs it," he said. "That's how it works best." But privately, he wondered if he'd live to see it. 80 years was a good run for a fisherman, and he could feel his body winding down like the Ruth Marie's engine when it was running out of fuel. Not sick, not dying, just tired. That night he dreamed of pearls, not finding them but being inside them, layer upon layer of nacre building around him, transforming his grief and memories into something luminous and eternal. He woke feeling strangely peaceful, as if he'd received a message he couldn't quite translate but understood nonetheless. The next morning brought unexpected visitors, a film crew from a major network wanting to document the pearl phenomenon, as they called it. Samuel tried to decline, but Dr. Martinez convinced him his story needed to be told. "Not for fame," she insisted, "but because people need hope, Sam. They need to know that loss isn't the end, that the universe hasn't forgotten them." So Samuel agreed, spending 3 days being interviewed, taking the crew out on the Ruth Marie, with young fishermen at the helm, visiting the museum, where crowds still gathered to touch the memory pearl. He told his story simply, without embellishment, but the interviewer kept pushing for more drama, more emotion. "How did you feel when you found the pearl?" she asked for the 5th time. Samuel thought about it, really thought about it, then said, "Like the sea was saying sorry, and like Ruth and Charlie were saying it's okay." That moment, that simple truth, became the heart of the documentary. When it aired months later, it sparked a new wave of visitors to the museum, people carrying their own grief, looking for their own apologies from the universe. But it also brought something unexpected, a letter from a lawyer in Boston stating that Eleanor Blackwood had passed away and left something for Samuel in her will. The something turned out to be a collection of maritime documents dating back 300 years, including maps and journals that might indicate where pearls had been found historically. "She wanted you to have these," the lawyer explained. "Said you'd know what to do with them." Samuel donated them to Lynn's research project immediately, but not before noting something interesting. Several of the marked locations formed a pattern, almost like a constellation across the world's oceans. Lynn saw it too, her eyes lighting up with scientific excitement. "It's following ocean currents," she said, "but not current currents, ancient ones from before the continents fully separated. Sam, if this is right, the pearls aren't random. They're following a path billions of years old. The implications were staggering that perhaps the pearls were indeed connected to something ancient and vast, a remnant of Earth's earliest oceans preserved in some impossible way. But Samuel found he cared less about the how than the why. The pearls appeared to heal, to help to remind humanity that wonder existed. That was enough. Winter came early that year, bringing storms that kept the boats in harbor for days at a time. Samuel used the forced inactivity to write, documenting not just his own story, but all the stories he'd collected over the years, the grievers who'd touched the memory pearl, the children who'd found hope at the hospital, the scientists who'd rediscovered wonder through studying something that shouldn't exist. He was deep in writing one afternoon when a knock came at his door. He opened it to find a young woman, maybe 25, with haunted eyes and salt-stained cheeks. "Mr. Rowe, I'm Sarah. I lost my father 2 weeks ago. Sailing accident. They say you understand about the pearls, about the sea. I don't know why I'm here, I need to understand why the sea takes so much." Samuel invited her in, made tea, and listened to her story. Her father had been an experienced sailor caught by a sudden squall, gone before anyone could help. She was angry at the sea, at God, at her father, for taking unnecessary risks, at herself for not being there. "The sea doesn't take personally," Samuel said gently. "It just is. Vast and beautiful and dangerous and giving all at once. Your father knew that, accepted it. That doesn't make your loss easier, but maybe it helps to know he died in a place he loved, doing what he loved." "But why does it have to take it all?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. Samuel thought about all his years of wrestling with this same question. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know it also gives. The same sea that took my family gave me the pearl that helped me heal. The same sea that took your father will feed families, inspire artists, carry ships that reunite lovers. It's not fair or unfair, it's just vast enough to contain everything, joy and sorrow both." They talked until sunset, and when Sarah left, she seemed lighter, somehow. Not healed, but beginning to heal. Samuel watched her go, thinking about all the people who'd come to him over the years seeking answers he didn't really have, finding comfort in shared incomprehension. That night the storm intensified, and Samuel heard something he hadn't heard in years, the deep resonant sound that had preceded his discovery of the dawn pearl. He went to his window and saw lights in the water, not one, but dozens, like stars fallen into the sea. He pulled on his coat and walked down to the dock where other townspeople were gathering, all staring at the incredible display. The lights pulsed in unison, copper and gold and silver, moving slowly through the water like a vast school of luminous fish. "Phosphorescence," someone said, but everyone knew it wasn't. This was something else, something unprecedented. Lynn appeared beside Samuel, her equipment in hand, trying to take readings, but her instruments were going haywire. "Sam, this is impossible. The electromagnetic signatures, it's like the whole ocean is alive." The lights moved closer to shore, and as they did, people began to cry, not from sadness, but from a kind of overwhelming awe. Children pressed against their parents, elderly couples held hands, fishermen who'd seen everything stood slack-jawed. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the lights dove deep and vanished, leaving only the normal darkness of a storm-tossed sea. But on the beach, as people turned on flashlights and phone lights, they found them dozens of small pearls, none larger than a marble, scattered along the tide line like gifts. People picked them up wonderingly, and Samuel noticed something remarkable. Each person seemed drawn to a particular pearl, as if they were choosing each other. Sarah, who'd visited him that afternoon, found one that glowed particularly bright in her hands. Tommy Garrett's grandson, born after Danny's rescue, toddled to one half buried in sand. Even Leonard, still mourning Helen, discovered one that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. "What do we do with them?" someone asked. Samuel looked at the gathered townspeople, each cradling their small miracle, and said, "What feels right? Keep them, give them away, throw them back. The pearls know their purpose better than we do." Over the following days, stories emerged. Some people kept their pearls as talismans, others gave them to people who needed them more, and a few threw them back into the sea with wishes or prayers. The event made international news. Scientists descended on the town, and theories proliferated. But no one could explain what had happened or why. Lynn thought it might be related to the 73-year cycle, a kind of eruption of whatever force created the pearls. Dr. Tanaka flew in from Japan and theorized about tectonic pressures and rare mineralogical events. The media called it everything from a miracle to mass hallucination. But Samuel knew better. Sitting on his porch, watching the sea return to its normal rhythms, he understood that this had been the sea's grand gesture, its way of saying that everyone who'd been touched by loss deserved a little magic, a little proof that they hadn't been forgotten. The town changed after that night. People were kinder to each other, more aware of the grief everyone carried, more willing to share their own. The pearls became a kind of secret language. Someone would touch the small bulge in their pocket during hard times, and others who carried pearls would notice and offer silent support. Samuel's health began to decline that winter. Nothing dramatic, just the slow winding down of a body that had lived hard for 8 decades. He spent more time writing, documenting not just the pearl stories, but his memories of Ruth and Charlie, of his grandfather, of a life spent between land and sea. Spring arrived late that year, and with it came a letter that would change everything once more. It arrived on a Tuesday morning when Samuel was struggling with his coffee maker, his arthritic hands barely cooperating. The return address was from a law firm in Seattle, but the letter inside was personal, handwritten by someone named James Rowe. "Dear Samuel," it began, "you don't know me, but I'm your cousin. Your grandfather's brother William was my grandfather. I've spent the last 10 years researching our family history, and I've discovered something you need to know about the pearls." Samuel had to sit down, his legs suddenly unsteady. He'd never known his grandfather had a brother. His family had always been small, insular. Just his parents and grandparents, then Ruth and Charlie, then nothing. The idea of extended family, of connections he'd never known existed, overwhelmed him. James's letter continued with a story that made Samuel's hands tremble. William Rowe had been with his grandfather the day they found the first pearl had been part of the fight with Cornelius Blackwood. But there was more. William had kept a journal, and in it he'd documented not just that discovery, but a pattern going back generations. The Rowe family, it seemed, had been connected to the pearls for far longer than anyone had realized. "Every third generation," James wrote, "a Rowe has found or been near the discovery of a pearl. It goes back to at least 1704, when our ancestor Thomas Rowe sailed with a merchant fleet. I have his ship's log. He wrote about finding a pearl of impossible size and beauty after losing his son to fever at sea. He gave it to a church where it was displayed until it mysteriously vanished 50 years later." The letter included copies of documents, ship logs, church records, even a daguerreotype from the 1800s showing another Rowe ancestor holding what was unmistakably a pearl, like the one Samuel knew so well. The evidence was overwhelming. His family was somehow tied to these miraculous appearances, guardians or witnesses to the sea's strange gifts. Samuel called Leonard immediately, and his friend came over to examine the documents with him. They spread everything out on Samuel's kitchen table, 2 old men piecing together a puzzle that spanned centuries. "This is incredible, Sam," Leonard said, tracing the family tree James had included. "Look at this. Every one of them lost someone to the sea before finding a pearl. It's like the pearls seek out your family specifically." "Or my family seeks out the pearls?" Samuel said quietly. He was thinking of Charlie, wondering if his son would have been the next guardian, the next witness to wonder. The thought brought fresh grief, even after all these years. James had included his phone number, and after debating for 3 days, Samuel finally called. The voice that answered was younger than expected, warm and eager. "Uncle Samuel, I'm so glad you called. I've been researching this for so long, and when I saw the news about your discovery, I knew I had to reach out." They talked for 2 hours. James was a marine archaeologist, which suddenly seemed less like coincidence and more like destiny. He'd been drawn to the sea despite growing up in Iowa, had felt called to study maritime history without understanding why until he'd discovered the family connection. "I want to come visit," James said. "To meet you, to see the pearl, to understand what this all means. Would that be okay?" Samuel agreed, though the idea of suddenly having family again after so long alone felt strange, almost frightening. He'd built his life around solitude and loss. What did it mean to have connections he'd never known about? James arrived a week later, and Samuel was startled to see his grandfather's eyes looking back at him from a face 50 years younger. They embraced awkwardly at first, then with genuine warmth as recognition of shared blood overcame the strangeness of meeting so late in life. James had brought more documents, including something that took Samuel's breath away, a photograph of his grandfather and William together as young men standing on a dock Samuel recognized as the old Portland harbor before it was modernized. They looked happy, arms around each other's shoulders, unaware of the rift that would separate them. William never forgave himself for siding with Cornelius initially, James explained as they sat in Samuel's kitchen. His journal is full of regret. He tried to reconnect with your grandfather multiple times, but the old man was stubborn. Family trait, Leonard said from where he was making coffee, and they all laughed. James stayed for a week, and during that time he and Samuel pieced together more of the story. The pearls appeared not just to the Rowe family, but to families connected to them. Margaret Chen's great-uncle had known Samuel's grandfather Lynn was distantly related to the lighthouse keeper, who'd helped save William from Cornelius's sinking ship. It was a web of connections spanning centuries and oceans. "It's like the sea has been weaving a tapestry," James said one evening as they watched the sunset from Samuel's porch. "Each pearl is a thread, each discovery connects to others, creating something bigger than any individual story." Samuel thought about this, about patterns too large to see from ground level, about purposes that revealed themselves only across generations. "Maybe that's why I was supposed to give it away," he said, "to make it part of the larger pattern instead of keeping it separate." James nodded, then pulled something from his bag. It was a small pearl, no bigger than a pea, mounted in an old silver setting. "This was William's," he said. "He found it on the beach the day after Cornelius's ship sank. Kept it his whole life, passed it down through the family. I want you to have it." Samuel took the pearl, feeling the weight of family history in his palm. 3 pearls now connected to him, the Dawn Pearl, in the museum. The Memory Pearl, touching thousands of lives, and this tiny family heirloom that had traveled through generations to reach him. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He stood at his window looking out at the moonlit sea and felt the presence of all those who'd come before Thomas Rowe in 1704, finding solace in wonder after loss. His grandfather trying to do right and living with the consequences. William carrying regret like a stone, and all the others documented and undocumented who'd been part of this strange story. The next morning, Lynn arrived with urgent news. "Sam, you need to see this." She spread satellite images on his table images showing unusual formations on the ocean floor near where he'd found the Dawn Pearl. These appeared after that night with all the lights, the night everyone found pearls. It's like something opened up down there. The formations were circular, arranged in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. At the center was what appeared to be a massive depression, like something had risen from the seafloor and left a void behind. "I want to send down a submersible," Lynn said, "to see what's there. Will you come with us?" Samuel's first instinct was to refuse. He was 80 years old, tired, and had no business going on underwater expeditions. But looking at James's eager face, at Lynn's excitement, at Leonard's knowing smile, he realized this might be his last chance to fully understand the mystery that had defined his life's final chapters. "When?" he asked. The expedition was arranged for 2 weeks later. Dr. Martinez pulled strings to get funding and equipment, the museum eager to understand more about the pearl's origins. James insisted on coming, his expertise in maritime archaeology suddenly invaluable. Even Leonard, despite his age, declared he wouldn't miss it. The morning of the dive, Samuel stood on the research vessel's deck, looking down at the submersible that would take them to depths he'd only imagined. It was a 3-person craft, which meant not everyone could go on the first dive. Lynn would pilot, Samuel would observe, and James would document. "You sure about this, Sam?" Leonard asked. "No shame in staying topside." "I need to see," Samuel said simply. The descent was like traveling through layers of time. Sunlight faded from gold to green to deep blue to black. The pressure increased, making the submersible creak ominously, though Lynn assured them this was normal. Strange creatures drifted past the lights, jellyfish like living galaxies. Fish with eyes that glowed like pearls themselves. At 800 feet, they reached the formations. Samuel's breath caught. It wasn't just circular patterns. It was a structure clearly artificial, or at least organized by something intelligent. Pillars of what looked like compressed nacre rose from the seafloor, arranged in concentric circles around a central pit that seemed to go down forever. "This is impossible," Lynn breathed. "These formations, they're not geological. They're biological, but on a scale that shouldn't exist." James was recording everything, his hands shaking with excitement. "Look at the patterns on the pillars. They're similar to the microscopic structure of pearl nacre, but magnified thousands of times." They circled the formation, documenting everything, and that's when Samuel saw it, a glimmer from the central pit, a pulse of that familiar copper light. "There," he said, pointing. "Take us closer to the edge." Lynn maneuvered carefully, and as they approached the pit's edge, their lights penetrated perhaps 50 feet into the darkness before being swallowed. But in that 50 feet, they could see movement, slow, rhythmic, like breathing. "Something's alive down there," James whispered. Lynn checked her instruments. "We're getting massive electromagnetic readings. Whatever's down there, it's huge. And Sam, the signatures match the Dawn Pearl exactly." They stayed as long as they safely could, gathering data, taking photographs, and video collecting water samples. As they prepared to ascend, Samuel took one last look into the pit and could have sworn he saw an eye, massive, ancient, and unmistakably aware, looking back at him. But it didn't feel threatening. It felt maternal somehow, like the sea itself was watching its children. The ascent was quiet, each of them processing what they'd seen. When they broke the surface and were hauled aboard the research vessel, Leonard was waiting anxiously. "Well," he demanded. "There's something down there," Samuel said. "Something alive, something that's been making the pearls. Or maybe something that is the pearls in a way we don't understand." The video footage caused a sensation in the scientific community. Marine biologists, geologists, even theoretical physicists weighed in with theories. Some suggested it was a colony organism, like a massive coral that had developed the ability to create pearls. Others theorized about prehistoric creatures surviving in deep-sea pockets. A few brave souls suggested something more exotic, a manifestation of the planet's consciousness. Gaia theory made real. But the most interesting response came from Dr. Tanaka, who video called from Japan with an expression of awe and fear. "I found references in ancient Japanese texts," he said. "Stories of Ryujin's true form, not as a dragon, but as something vast and formless that dwells in the deep places, creating treasures to remind humanity of its connection to the sea. They called it the Mother of Pearls, the Breathing Deep." The team wanted to mount another expedition to go deeper to learn more, but 3 days after the dive, the entire formation vanished. Satellite images showed smooth seafloor where the pillars had been. The pit was gone. It was as if the entire structure had been a temporary revelation shown just long enough to confirm its existence before retreating back into mystery. "Maybe we weren't meant to find it," Samuel suggested when Lynn expressed frustration. "Maybe it was just letting us know it's there, that the pearls aren't random, but part of something bigger." The discovery changed how people thought about the pearls. They weren't just treasures or anomalies, they were messages from something vast and incomprehensible but seemingly benevolent. The museum updated its display to include the footage, and visitors stood transfixed by the images of those nacre pillars, that endless pit, that suggestion of an eye in the deep. Samuel found himself changed too. The fear of the sea that had defined him since Ruth and Charlie's death had transformed completely. He understood now that the sea wasn't his enemy or his friend. It was something far more complex, a living system of which he was just a tiny part. The pearls were its way of communicating, of acknowledging the grief it caused while offering consolation. Winter came again, and with it Samuel's health declined more noticeably. He had good days and bad days, days when he could walk to the harbor, and days when he couldn't leave his chair. James had extended his stay, unwilling to leave his newfound uncle, and had essentially moved into Samuel's spare room. "You don't have to stay," Samuel told him one particularly bad morning when his joints felt like they were full of ground glass. "You have your own life to get back to." "This is my life," James replied simply. "Family, the pearls, the mystery of it all. Plus, someone needs to make sure you eat something besides canned soup and crackers." Leonard visited daily, and together, the three of them formed an unlikely family. 2 old fishermen and a young archaeologist bound together by pearls and wonder. Lynn came by frequently too, as did Margaret, and others whose lives had been touched by Samuel's discovery. One evening, as they sat around Samuel's fireplace, James asked the question that had been hovering unspoken for weeks. What happens to the responsibility if our family really is connected to the pearls, if we're somehow guardians or witnesses who takes over when... He couldn't finish the sentence, but Samuel understood. You do, he said simply. You and Lynn and everyone else who understands that the pearls aren't about ownership, but about connection. The sea will choose who it needs. That night, Samuel dreamed again of being inside a pearl. But this time, he wasn't alone. Ruth was there, and Charlie and his grandfather and people he didn't recognize but somehow knew were family, all the Rows who'd been touched by the sea's strange gifts. They didn't speak, but he understood their message. The pattern would continue. The pearls would keep appearing. The sea would keep its ancient covenant with humanity. He woke to find James sitting by his bed, looking worried. You were talking in your sleep, James said. Something about the tide coming in. Samuel smiled. Just visiting with family. Spring returned, and with it, Samuel found a reserve of strength. He insisted on one more boat trip, one more morning on the water. James and Leonard helped him onto the Ruth Marie, and they motored out to the spot where everything had begun, where the dawn pearl had waited for him to find it. The sea was calm, almost glass-like, reflecting the dawn sky in shades of pearl. Samuel stood at the rail supported by James and Leonard and pulled out the small pearl William had found, the one James had given him. Time for this to go home, he said, and dropped it into the water. The pearl sank slowly, catching the early light, and as it disappeared, Samuel could have sworn he saw that copper glow rising to meet it, welcoming it back. The three men stood in silence, watching the water, feeling the weight of moment and meaning. When they returned to harbor, a crowd was waiting. Word had somehow spread about Samuel's morning voyage, and people wanted to see him, to thank him, to share how the pearls had changed their lives. It was overwhelming and beautiful, and Samuel felt tears on his cheeks as person after person told their story. Sarah, the young woman who'd lost her father, showed him how her small pearl had helped her start a foundation for maritime safety education. Tommy Garrett and Danny had expanded their program to 3 boats and 50 kids. The Children's Hospital had created an entire therapy program around Lynn's pearl. The museum had become a pilgrimage site for people dealing with loss. The ripples from that single discovery had spread far beyond anything Samuel could have imagined. That evening, exhausted but content, Samuel sat on his porch with James and Leonard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in impossible colors, and the sea was singing its eternal song. I have something for you both, Samuel said, pulling out 2 envelopes he'd prepared weeks ago. To Leonard, he gave the deed to the Ruth Marie. She needs someone who understands her, who will take care of her. Leonard's eyes filled with tears. Sam, I can't. You can and you will. Take kids out, teach them about the sea. Keep the connection alive. To James, he gave a different document, all his research, his writings, his documentation of the pearl discoveries. Continue the work. Not hunting for pearls, but understanding them, helping them find who needs them. You're a Rowe. This is what we do. James nodded, unable to speak. They sat together as darkness fell, 3 generations of sea-touched souls, guardians of wonder. Samuel felt complete in a way he hadn't since before Ruth and Charlie died. The circle was closing, but it was also opening, expanding to include new people, new stories, new possibilities. That night, Samuel's sleep was peaceful. He dreamed not of loss, but of connection, not of endings, but of continuations. Somewhere in the deep, something vast and patient breathed, creating treasures, layer by layer, waiting to offer them to those who needed them most. The morning brought news that made everyone along the coast stand still in wonder. Overnight pearls had appeared in tidal pools along a 50-mile stretch of coastline, not many, perhaps 24 total, but each one found by someone who needed it. A child with terminal cancer found one that glowed so bright it could be seen through her closed fist. An elderly widower discovered one that hummed with a sound like his late wife's laughter. A fisherman who'd lost 3 brothers to the sea found one that somehow contained all the colors of sunset. Lynn and her team scrambled to document the occurrence, but Samuel just smiled. The sea was saying goodbye, or perhaps hello, or perhaps both at once. The pattern was accelerating, the mystery deepening, even as some parts of it became clear. It's beautiful, James said, standing beside Samuel as they watched the excited crowds on the beach. It's like the whole ocean is celebrating something. Or preparing for something, Samuel said quietly. He could feel it in his bones, a shift coming, a change in the ancient pattern. The pearls were no longer rare miracles, but were becoming something else, seeds of a new understanding between humanity and the sea. Dr. Martinez called with remarkable news. The dawn pearl had changed subtly but measurably. Its glow had intensified and new colors were appearing in its depths. More remarkably, every pearl they could test, the memory pearl, Lynn's pearl, at the hospital, the new ones from the beach, was showing the same changes. They're synchronizing, she said, her voice filled with scientific excitement and something close to fear. All the pearls everywhere are beginning to pulse in unison. Samuel, what did you do when you dropped that pearl in the ocean? But Samuel didn't have an answer, or at least not one that would satisfy a scientist. He'd returned a gift to its source, completed a circle, honored a connection. Sometimes that was enough to change everything. The synchronization phenomenon drew international attention. Scientists, mystics, reporters, and pilgrims flooded the small coastal town. The pearls became a global sensation, with people claiming everything from alien contact to divine intervention. But Samuel stayed quiet, spending his days on his porch, watching the sea, feeling the pattern complete itself in ways beyond words. One morning, Lynn brought remarkable footage from an underwater drone. Near where the formation had been, new structures were appearing, smaller, more delicate, but unmistakably related to what they'd seen before. They looked like gardens of nacre growing from the seafloor in impossible spirals and curves. It's spreading, Lynn said. Not just here, we're getting reports from all over the world. These formations are appearing wherever pearls have been found. It's like the ocean is decorating itself. Samuel thought about that word, decorating. It implied consciousness, choice, aesthetic sense. Was the sea making itself beautiful for humanity to discover? Or had it always been this way, and humans were just now being invited to see? That afternoon, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a pearl, unlike any Samuel had seen, black as night, but with depths that seemed to contain stars. It came with a simple note, for the guardian who understood, from those who swim in deeper waters. Samuel held the black pearl, feeling its weight, its warmth, its impossibility. He knew he should give it to Lynn for study or to the museum for display, but something told him this one was different. This one was personal. That evening, as he held the black pearl and watched the sunset, Samuel felt a presence beside him. Not threatening, not even fully physical, but unmistakably there. He turned to see a shimmer in the air like heat waves, but more purposeful, roughly human-shaped, but constantly flowing. "You're ready to see," a voice said, though it came from inside his head rather than through his ears. The pearls were just the beginning, the invitation. Your kind is ready for the next revelation. "What are you?" Samuel asked, surprisingly calm. "We are what you call the sea, but we are also more. We are the connection between water and consciousness, between depth and dreams. We have watched your species for millennia, waiting for you to develop enough wisdom to meet us properly. The pearls were our calling cards." The presence shifted, and Samuel could almost make out features, ancient, beautiful, alien, yet familiar. "You gave away the pearl instead of keeping it. You understood it was meant to connect, not possess. That wisdom, repeated by others who found our gifts, has shown us you're ready." Ready for what? Partnership. The ocean covers most of your world, yet you know less about it than about the moon. We offer knowledge, healing, understanding. But first you must heal the wounds between your kind and the waters. The pearls will help, but the real work is just beginning. The presence began to fade, but before it disappeared entirely, it said, "The black pearl is yours to keep. It will help you see us when we rise. And Samuel Rowe, thank you. Your sacrifice and wisdom have opened doors that were closed for centuries." Tea in stunned silence after the presence faded, the black pearl warm in his palm like a living thing. The sunset had deepened to purple and gold, and the sea seemed different now, not just water and waves, but something conscious, watching, waiting. He heard footsteps on his porch, and turned to find James and Leonard approaching, their faces etched with concern. "Sam, you okay?" Leonard asked. "You've been sitting out here for 3 hours. We were starting to worry." 3 hours. It had felt like minutes. Samuel looked at the black pearl, then at his friends, his family, and made a decision. "Sit down, both of you. There's something I need to tell you." He described the encounter, the presence, the message about partnership and healing. James listened with the intensity of a scholar discovering a new civilization, while Leonard's weathered face showed a mixture of skepticism and belief. When Samuel finished, he held out the black pearl for them to see. "My God," James breathed, reaching out tentatively. "It's like looking into space itself." "Don't touch it," Samuel warned instinctively. I think it's specifically attuned to me, part of being the guardian or witness or whatever I am." Leonard was quiet for a long moment, then said, "You know what this means, don't you? If there really are beings in the ocean, if they're ready to make contact, Sam, this changes everything, the whole world." Before Samuel could respond, his phone rang. It was Lynn, her voice urgent. "Sam, you need to turn on the news, any channel. It's happening everywhere." They rushed inside and Samuel fumbled with the remote until the television flickered to life. The screen showed aerial footage of the coast of Japan where massive formations of bioluminescent patterns were spreading across the water's surface, intricate mandalas of light that pulsed with the same rhythm as the pearls. This phenomenon is being reported simultaneously in 12 locations worldwide, the news anchor said clearly, struggling to maintain professional composure. Scientists are calling it unprecedented. The patterns appear to be emanating from underwater sources and are visible from space. The image switched to satellite footage, and Samuel gasped. The patterns weren't random. They formed a message written in a script that seemed to bypass language and speak directly to understanding. "We are here," it said. "We are ready. Are you—" The phone rang again. Dr. Martinez this time. "Samuel, the Dawn Pearl, it's doing something extraordinary. You need to see this. Can you send video? Check your phone." The video showed the Dawn Pearl in its display case, but instead of its usual steady glow, it was projecting images, hazy, dreamlike, but unmistakable. Cities of pearl beneath the waves, beings of water and light tending vast gardens, humans and sea dwellers working together, exchanging knowledge, healing both ocean and land. "It's showing the future," Samuel said quietly, "or a possible future." Over the next 24 hours, the world changed. The bioluminescent patterns appeared in more locations, each one unique, but clearly part of the same phenomenon. Pearls everywhere began projecting similar visions. Scientists detected massive movements in ocean currents as if the sea itself was reorganizing. Marine life exhibited unprecedented behavior. Whales singing in harmonies never before recorded, dolphins approaching shores in peaceful assemblies, even typically aggressive sharks becoming docile and curious. But not everyone welcomed these changes. Fear spread alongside wonder. Military vessels were deployed to monitor the phenomena. Religious groups declared everything from the end times to the second coming. Conspiracy theorists blamed everything from aliens to government experiments. Samuel found himself at the center of a storm of attention. Somehow, word had spread about his encounter with the presence. Reporters, scientists, government officials, everyone wanted to talk to the man who'd first found the Dawn Pearl, who'd supposedly communicated with whatever was revealing itself in the oceans. "I can't handle this," Samuel told James after the fifth government agency called requesting his cooperation. "I'm 80 years old. I just wanted to live quietly by the sea." "But you're the bridge," James said gently. "You're the one they chose to speak through first. Like it or not, you're part of this." That evening, as Samuel sat on his porch trying to avoid the chaos, the black pearl in his pocket began to warm. He pulled it out and found it glowing with an inner light that seemed to pull at his consciousness. Without thinking, he raised it to his eye like a lens. The world transformed. Through the pearl, he could see them, the beings the presence had spoken of. They moved through the water like living currents, their forms constantly shifting between states of matter. Some were enormous, the size of whales, while others were tiny as plankton, but all were unmistakably aware, unmistakably intelligent. One approached the shore, and through the pearl, Samuel could see its features more clearly. It had what might have been a face eyes that held depths of experience beyond human comprehension, something like a mouth that curved in what could only be described as a smile. "Samuel Rowe." It spoke directly into his mind. We need your help. The revelation is happening too fast. Your kind is frightened. Some speak of war, of defending against invasion. This is not our intent. What do you want me to do? Speak for us. You understand loss and gift-taking and giving. Help your kind understand we are not conquerors but neighbors, not threats but teachers. We have watched humanity poison the waters, but we have also seen your capacity for wonder and change. The pearls were our test. Those who gave them away, who shared the magic, they proved humanity might be ready. I don't know how to convince the entire world of anything. I'm just a fisherman. You convinced one person to give away treasure, then another, then dozens. Start small. The tide begins with a single wave. The being retreated, and Samuel lowered the pearl, finding himself back on his familiar porch, but forever changed. James and Leonard were watching him with concern. You were in some kind of trance, Leonard said. Your eyes went completely black for a moment. Samuel explained what he'd seen and heard, and together they formulated a plan. Not to convince the world that was too large a task, but to start with their town, their coast, the people who'd been touched by the pearls. The next morning, they called a town meeting. The small community hall was packed beyond capacity, with people spilling out onto the street. Samuel stood at the podium, the black pearl in his pocket, lending him strength, and began to speak. Most of you know me. You know I found the dawn pearl and gave it away. You know I've lived by this sea for 80 years, lost my family to it, and somehow found meaning in that loss. Now I need to tell you something that might sound impossible, but I'm asking you to listen with the same open hearts you brought when you first heard about the pearls. He told them everything, the patterns in his family history, the structure beneath the sea, the presence that had spoken to him, the beings he'd seen through the black pearl. He spoke simply without dramatics, the way he'd always told stories on his boat. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Sarah, the young woman who'd lost her father, stood up. I believe you, Mr. Rowe. The night I found my pearl, I saw something in the water, like a face made of moonlight on waves. It looked at me with such compassion, I knew I wasn't alone. Others began sharing similar experiences. Tommy Garrett admitted he'd heard voices in the water the night Danny was rescued, guiding him to where his son would be found. An elderly fisherman revealed he'd been seeing figures in the fog for years, but thought he was going senile. One by one, the stories built a picture of contact that had been happening subtly for years, preparing for this moment. So what do we do? Someone asked. We show the world that we're not afraid, Samuel said. Tomorrow morning, anyone who's willing, we go out on the water. We bring our pearls. We invite them to meet us properly. Not as military force, not as scientific expedition, but as neighbors introducing themselves. The crowd dispersed with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. That night, the media caught wind of the plan. By morning, news vans lined the harbor and helicopters circled overhead. But also present were hundreds of townspeople carrying their small pearls, ready to trust in wonder over fear. The flotilla that assembled was unlike anything the harbor had ever seen. Fishing boats, pleasure craft, kayaks, even paddleboards, anything that could float, carried people out into the calm morning water. Samuel stood on the Ruth Marie with James at the helm and Leonard beside him, the black pearl held high like a beacon. A mile from shore, they stopped and waited. The water was still almost glassy, reflecting the crowd of boats and the larger crowd watching from shore. Samuel raised the black pearl to his eye and gasped. The beings were everywhere, surrounding the boats, waiting just beneath the surface. Through the pearl, he could see their excitement, their hope, their own nervousness at this first official meeting. They're here, he said loudly enough for nearby boats to hear. Everyone with a pearl, hold it up. Show them we accept their gift. Dozens of pearls rose into the morning light, glowing with their inner fire. The water began to change, taking on that familiar copper luminescence. Then slowly, carefully, the beings began to surface. They didn't emerge dramatically. Instead, they let themselves be partially seen, a curve of translucent flesh. Here, an impossibly beautiful eye, their forms that suggested rather than displayed. The message was clear. We are here, but we won't overwhelm you. A child on a nearby boat laughed with delight rather than fear, reaching out to touch a tendril of living water that had approached her kayak. Her parents moved to stop her, then froze as the tendril gently touched the child's hand, leaving a small pearl in her palm. That broke the tension. All around the flotilla, the beings began interacting with the humans gently, carefully, but with obvious joy. They created small whirlpools that sparkled with bioluminescence. They sang in harmonies that could be felt in the chest more than heard. They projected images onto the water's surface, memories of the ocean's history, visions of possible futures. One being approached the Ruth Marie, larger than the others, more defined. Through the black pearl, Samuel could see it clearly. Ancient wise carrying the weight of millennia. It rose partially from the water, and Samuel found himself looking into an eye the size of a dinner plate filled with intelligence and compassion. "Thank you." The being said, its voice resonating through the water and into the bones of everyone present. "This is the beginning we hoped for." The contact lasted an hour. Then the beings retreated, leaving the humans to process what they'd experienced. As the boats returned to harbor, Samuel noticed something remarkable. The fear was gone. People were talking excitedly, sharing what they'd seen and felt, already making plans to come back tomorrow. The footage from that morning went viral within hours. Not the shaky, unclear videos of supposed cryptid sightings, but clear, undeniable evidence of contact with an intelligent aquatic species. Scientists around the world scrambled to explain it. Governments convened emergency sessions. Religious leaders sought meaning in ancient texts. But in the small coastal town, people simply accepted it. The sea had always been mysterious. Now it was mysterious with a face, a voice, a purpose. Over the following weeks, similar contact events occurred worldwide. The beings who called themselves the pelagics, when asked, though they said names were human constructs they adopted for convenience, were careful not to appear everywhere at once. They emerged gradually, allowing humanity time to adjust. They shared knowledge carefully, too. Through the pearls which they revealed were biological communication devices they'd been seeding for centuries. They taught selected humans about ocean currents that could predict weather years in advance. They showed how certain combinations of minerals could clean polluted water. They demonstrated sustainable fishing techniques that actually increased populations while providing food. But not everyone welcomed the pelagics. A militant group calling itself the Terrestrial Defense League formed, declaring the beings an invasion force. They attacked several contact sites, though the pelagics simply retreated when threatened, refusing to engage in violence. Samuel found himself appointed to a hastily formed UN Committee on Human-Pelagic Relations. Though he protested, he was too old and unqualified. "You're the first contact," the Secretary General told him. "Your word carries weight with both species." The meetings were exhausting, full of politicians and scientists who wanted to study, exploit, or defend against the pelagics. Samuel listened to hours of debate, then stood and spoke from his heart. "You're all missing the point," he said. "The pelagics aren't here to be studied or fought or used. They're here because we're finally ready to learn something crucial, that we're not alone, not separate from nature, not masters of the earth. We're part of something larger, and they're offering to teach us how to be better parts." His words were broadcast globally, and while they didn't convince everyone, they resonated with millions who'd felt the truth of them when touching their pearls or seeing the beings in person. One evening, exhausted from another day of meetings, Samuel walked alone to the shore. The black pearl had become a constant weight in his pocket, a reminder of responsibilities he'd never asked for but couldn't abandon. As he stood at the water's edge, a familiar presence materialized beside him, the same shimmering form that had first spoken to him months ago. "You're tired," the presence observed. "I'm old," Samuel replied. "This should be happening to someone younger, someone with energy and years ahead of them." "It's happening to exactly who it should. You understand loss and transformation. You know that sometimes the most profound changes come from the deepest grief. Your species is grieving now for the world you're losing, the simplicity that's ending the isolation that protected and limited you. You're the bridge because you've crossed these waters before. What happens next? That depends on humanity. We can teach, but you must choose to learn. We can heal the oceans, but you must stop poisoning them. We can share the deep mysteries, but you must approach them with wisdom rather than greed." The presence moved closer, and Samuel felt a warmth like summer sunshine. "Your part is almost done, Samuel Rowe. You opened the door, others will walk through it, but there is one more gift to give, one more pearl to place." "I don't understand." "You will. When the time comes, you'll know what to do with the black pearl. It's not just for seeing, it's for becoming. The presence faded, leaving Samuel alone with the rhythmic sound of waves and the weight of mysteries still unfolding. Months passed. The world slowly adjusted to the reality of the pelagics. Treaties were signed establishing protected zones where humans and pelagics could interact safely. Technology advanced in leaps as pelagic knowledge was carefully integrated with human science. The oceans began to heal as new techniques for cleaning and preservation were implemented. Samuel watched it all from his porch, his body growing frailer but his spirit oddly at peace. James had taken over most of his responsibilities, becoming a respected voice in human pelagic relations. Leonard still visited daily, though he too was showing his age more clearly. Lynn had made a remarkable discovery. The pearls weren't just communication devices, they were memory storage, each one containing the experiences and emotions of everyone who touched them. The Dawn Pearl, having been touched by thousands, had become a repository of human grief and wonder which the pelagics could access and understand. "They're learning about us through our pain and joy," Lynn explained during one of her visits. "Every tear shed while holding a pearl, every smile, every wish, it's all data to them, but more than data. It's like they're learning to feel what we feel." One winter morning, Samuel woke to find he couldn't rise from bed. His body had finally decided enough was enough. James called the doctor, but Samuel waved him off. "No hospitals," he said firmly. "I know what's happening. I want to be here in my home near the sea." Word spread quickly through the town. People came to visit to thank him, to share one more story of how the pearls had changed their lives. Margaret and Lynn came bringing tea and sitting quietly by his bedside. Tommy Garrett came with Danny and his grandson, 3 generations united by the sea's strange gifts. Even Dr. Martinez made the trip from Portland, bringing images from the museum. "The Dawn Pearl is doing something new," she said, showing him the photographs. "It's creating smaller pearls within itself, like it's reproducing. We don't understand it yet, but I thought you should know." Samuel smiled weakly. New generations for a new world. That night, with James and Leonard keeping vigil, Samuel felt the black pearl growing warm in his hand. He raised it with trembling fingers, looking through it one last time. The room filled with that familiar copper light, and suddenly they were not alone. The pelagics had come not physically, but in whatever form they took between states. The room was full of their presence, surrounding Samuel's bed like an honor guard. Through the black pearl he could see them clearly. Beautiful alien, infinitely compassionate. "It's time," the first presence said. "The black pearl isn't just for seeing Samuel. It's for crossing over. Your body is failing, but your consciousness doesn't have to end. You can join us, become part of the eternal dance between water and awareness. It's our gift to the bridge builder." Samuel understood then. The black pearl wasn't just a tool, it was an invitation, a doorway to a different kind of existence. He thought of Ruth, and Charlie wondered if they were part of this somehow, if the sea that had taken them had also transformed them. "Will I still be me?" he asked. "You'll be you and more. Every drop of ocean contains the memory of every other drop. You'll be Samuel Rowe, but also part of the great consciousness that connects all water, all life. You'll be with Ruth and Charlie in a way deeper than memory." Samuel looked at James and Leonard, both crying, now both understanding something profound was happening even if they couldn't see the pelagics. "Take care of each other," he told them. "Keep the story going. Help humanity and the pelagics learn to live together." "We will," James promised. "Uncle Samuel, we will." Samuel held the black pearl to his chest and felt himself dissolving, not dying, but transforming. His consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of his body, flowing out like a tide. He felt the sea welcoming him not as a victim, but as a friend returning home. He sensed Ruth and Charlie not as they were, but as they had become part of the vast web of consciousness that linked all water everywhere. His last physical sensation was the pearl dissolving into his chest, becoming part of him as he became part of something infinitely larger. His last sight through human eyes was James and Leonard holding each other as his body stilled. His first sight through new senses was the entirety of the ocean, every drop connected, every current, a thought, every wave, a heartbeat. Samuel Rowe died at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night in winter. But Samuel Rowe also lived on transformed part of the bridge between worlds that he'd helped to build. The funeral was held on a perfect morning, the sea calm as glass. The entire town attended, along with representatives from government scientific institutions and pelagic delegations who rose partially from the water to pay their respects. James gave the eulogy. Speaking of family, found late wisdom shared freely, courage in the face of impossibility. As they prepared to scatter Samuel's ashes where he'd found the dawn pearl, something remarkable happened. The water began to glow with that familiar copper light, and from the depths rose a pearl unlike any seen before. It was massive, the size of the original dawn pearl, but it contained multitude swirls of color, representing every emotion, every memory, every person Samuel had touched in his journey. It floated on the surface for a moment, then split into hundreds of smaller pearls, each one unique, each one perfect. They spread across the water like seeds, and everyone present understood the message. Samuel's transformation had created something new, not just a pearl, but a multiplication of possibility, a gift for future generations. James reached down and picked up one of the new pearls. Through it for just a moment he heard Samuel's voice, not gone, just changed, part of the eternal conversation between land and sea. "The story continues," Samuel's voice whispered. "Different forms, same love, same wonder. Take care of them all." The pearls were gathered and distributed according to a plan Samuel had left behind to libraries and schools, hospitals, and research centers, to anyone who would use them to build bridges rather than walls. Each pearl carried a piece of Samuel's story, his wisdom, his understanding that loss and gift were two faces of the same truth. Leonard took the Ruth Marie out one last time, carrying a small group of children who'd never known Samuel but had heard his story. As they reached the deep water, one of the children pointed excitedly at the waves. "Look, there's someone in the water." Leonard looked and saw, just for a moment, a face in the foam and spray. Samuel's face, but also Ruth's. Charlie's. All the faces of those the sea had taken and transformed. They were smiling, waving, part of the eternal dance now. "Yes," Leonard told the child. "There's someone in the water. There always has been. We just needed to learn how to see them." The boat continued on, carrying its young passengers into a world where humans and pelagics worked together, where the ocean was no longer alien, but allied, where pearls appeared when needed most to remind everyone that grief and wonder, loss and discovery, ending and beginning, were all part of the same vast story. And somewhere in the depths, in the space between water molecules, in the consciousness that connected every drop of ocean everywhere, Samuel Rowe continued his work, no longer as a man, but as a memory. Made manifest a bridge that would never crumble, a guardian of the covenant between two worlds, learning to become one. The dawn pearl still glowed in its museum case, but now it pulsed in rhythm with thousands of other pearls scattered across the world, each one a note in a symphony of connection that Samuel had begun by choosing wonder over wealth, gift over greed. His story had ended, but the story he'd started would continue as long as the tides rose and fell, as long as humans and pelagics shared the blue world, as long as pearls emerged from the deep to heal hearts and open minds. In the small coastal town where it all began, they erected a simple monument, not to Samuel alone, but to all the bridge builders, all the pearl finders, all those who'd chosen to see magic in the world rather than fear it. The inscription read, "Here began the age of pearls when Samuel Rowe found treasure and gave it away, teaching us that the greatest gifts are those we share." And every morning as the sun rose over the Atlantic, the monument's surface would gather dew that caught the light just right, creating tiny rainbows that looked, if you knew how to see them, exactly like pearls.